There are stories that make you shiver, stories that linger in your mind long after the lights go out. Tonight, I bring you 10 chilling true stories, real-life events so eerie, they remain unsolved to this day. From haunted objects to mysterious disappearances, from curses to creatures that defy logic, these are the tales that will make you question reality itself. But beware, some stories have a way of sticking with you. So turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and prepare for a journey into the unknown. Are you ready? Room 428. The late August humidity clung to Athens, Ohio, like a shroud, making the already imposing brick structure of Wilson Hall seem even more oppressive. Freshman Emily Carter hauled her overflowing suitcase up the worn stone steps, a mix of excitement and trepidation swirling in her stomach. This was college life, but a small, nagging unease tugged at her. She'd heard the stories, the whispers about room 428, her assigned room. Emily tried to dismiss the rumors. College campuses were rife with them, tales of ghosts and ghouls designed to spook nervous freshmen. But the stories about 428 felt different, more persistent, laced with a genuine fear that even the most seasoned upperclassmen couldn't quite hide. The suicide, the ritual, the lingering presence. It was all enough to make the hairs on her arms stand on end. The room itself was unremarkable, at least at first glance. Standard dorm fare, 2 twin beds pushed against opposite walls, matching desks, a shared closet. The beige paint was peeling in places, revealing patches of faded wallpaper underneath. A single window looked out onto the bustling campus, a stark contrast to the unsettling quiet that permeated the room. Emily's roommate, Sarah, was a bubbly, outgoing girl from Cincinnati, seemingly oblivious to the room's reputation. She chattered excitedly about orientation week, sororities, and the cute guy she'd met in the lobby. Emily forced a smile, trying to match her enthusiasm, but the chill in the air, despite the late summer heat, wouldn't leave her. That first night, Emily lay awake long after Sarah had drifted off to sleep. Every creak of the old building, every rustle of leaves outside the window, sent shivers down her spine. She imagined the dark figure lurking in the shadows, the unseen presence watching her. Just nerves, she told herself, it's just the stories. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. The next day, she decided to do some digging. The university library became her sanctuary, a place where she could immerse herself in research and perhaps find some rational explanation for the unsettling feeling that clung to room 428. She searched old student newspapers, local historical archives, anything that might shed light on the room's history. She found articles about the suicide, a brief, tragic account of a student named. The name was redacted. The details were sparse, but the article mentioned rumors of occult practices, a ritual gone wrong. Emily felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. The library's archives also yielded information about the history of Wilson Hall itself. Built in the early 1900s, it was originally a women's dormitory, a place of strict rules and hushed whispers. Emily learned about the different principals who had overseen the dorm, their personalities, their quirks. One name stood out, Principal Eleanor Vance. She was known for her stern demeanor and her unwavering belief in discipline and order. Rumors circulated among the students that she was a strict disciplinarian. Some even whispered of cruelty. As the week progressed, Emily's unease grew. Small things began to happen. A book would fall off the shelf with no apparent cause. The desk lamp would flicker erratically. A faint, floral scent, reminiscent of old perfume, would drift through the room and then vanish. Sarah, thankfully, remained oblivious, chalking it up to the quirks of an old building. But Emily knew, deep down, that it was more than that. One evening, while studying late at her desk, Emily heard a faint knocking. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed to be coming from inside the wall. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, deliberate. She held her breath, listening intently. Tap, tap, tap. Then, silence. She waited, her eyes fixed on the wall, expecting something, anything. But nothing happened. After a few minutes, she let out a shaky breath, trying to convince herself that she had imagined it. But the image of the faded wallpaper, the peeling paint, seemed to mock her, the silence amplifying the fear that was slowly consuming her. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was trying to communicate with her, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever it wasn't friendly. The knocking became a nightly ritual. Tap, tap, tap. Always 3 times, always from the same spot on the wall. Emily tried to ignore it, to bury herself in her studies, but the sound echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the unseen presence that shared her room. Sarah, bless her oblivious heart, slept through it all, her rhythmic snoring a counterpoint to the eerie tapping. Emily delved deeper into the history of Wilson Hall, desperate for answers. She discovered that Principal Vance, the stern woman who had once ruled the dorm with an iron fist, had a particular fondness for lilacs. The scent permeated her office, her living quarters, even the hallways during the spring. A shiver ran down Emily's spine. The faint floral scent she had noticed before. It smelled like lilacs. One afternoon, while exploring the dusty archives in the basement of the library, Emily stumbled upon a box labeled Wilson Hall, Incident Reports. Her heart pounded as she carefully opened it. Inside, she found a collection of handwritten notes detailing strange occurrences in the dorm over the years. Missing items, unexplained noises, a chilling account of a student who claimed to have seen a figure standing in the shadows of room 428. The figure, the student wrote, was tall and gaunt, with long, dark hair that obscured its face, and it smelled of lilacs. Emily's breath hitched. The pieces were starting to fit together. The knocking, the scent, the dark figure. It all pointed to something supernatural, something connected to the history of Wilson Hall, perhaps even to Principal Vance herself. But why room 428? What was so special about that particular room? Driven by a growing sense of dread, Emily began to research the history of the room itself. She discovered that it had originally been part of Principal Vance's private suite. It was her sitting room, a place where she would often retreat to read, write, and conduct meetings. Meetings that, according to some whispered rumors, involved more than just administrative matters. Rumors of seances, of occult practices, of a dark secret hidden within the walls of room 428. The suicide, Emily realized, must have been more than just a tragic event. It was connected to the room's dark history, to the rituals, to the presence that lingered within its walls. The student who had taken her own life had, according to the redacted article, been performing a ritual that was said to open a gateway to something that had been trapped, or perhaps summoned, by Principal Vance years ago. That night, the knocking was louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed to be coming from right above her head. Emily lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, the scent of lilacs heavy in the air. She closed her eyes, willing herself to fall asleep, but the tapping continued, a relentless reminder of the unseen presence that was growing stronger, more restless. Suddenly, the room grew cold, the temperature dropping dramatically. Emily shivered, pulling the covers tighter around her. A whisper, faint and chilling, echoed through the room. It sounded like a woman's voice, old and raspy, speaking in a language she didn't understand. Then, the whisper faded, replaced by a low, guttural growl. Emily's eyes flew open. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside the window. But in the shadows, she could see it. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing by the closet. Its face was obscured by long, dark hair, but she could feel its eyes on her, cold and piercing. And the scent of lilacs was overwhelming, suffocating. The figure raised its hand, pointing a long, bony finger at her. Emily screamed. a primal sound of terror that echoed through the silent dorm. The figure took a step closer, and as it did, a single word echoed through the room, a word that chilled Emily to the bone. Mine. Emily scrambled out of bed, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She fumbled for the light switch, desperate to illuminate the room, to banish the terrifying apparition that had materialized from the shadows. But the light flickered and died, plunging the room back into darkness. The figure remained unmoved, the scent of lilacs now so strong it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her. She stumbled backward, tripping over her discarded shoes, and fell to the floor. Panic seized her, a cold wave of terror that washed over her senses. She had to get out. She had to escape. But the door seemed miles away, the room shrinking, the darkness closing in. She could hear the figure moving, a slow, deliberate shuffle across the floor. Its breath, ragged and cold, brushed against her ear. Mine, it whispered again, the voice closer now, laced with an ancient malice that made her blood run cold. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for the inevitable. She waited for the touch, the icy grip of the spectral hand, but it never came. Instead, the room fell silent, the only sound her own ragged breathing. She slowly opened her eyes, peering into the darkness. The figure was gone. The scent of lilacs, however, lingered, a haunting reminder of the terrifying encounter. Emily lay on the floor, shaking, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't stay in that room, not another night. But where could she go? Who would believe her? Sarah, bless her, was no help. She woke up the next morning, groggy and confused, complaining about a strange dream. Emily tried to explain what had happened, but Sarah just brushed it off, attributing it to stress and lack of sleep. Emily felt a wave of despair wash over her. She was alone in this, facing something she didn't understand, something that seemed to be growing stronger, more malevolent. She decided to take matters into her own hands. She returned to the library, determined to uncover the truth about room 428, about Principal Vance, about the ritual that had unleashed this terrifying presence. She spent hours poring over old books on the occult, searching for any mention of the ritual, any clue to how to banish the entity that now haunted her waking hours. She discovered that the ritual involved a complex series of incantations, sacrifices, and symbolic objects. It was designed to open a gateway to the spirit world, to summon a powerful entity that could grant wishes, but at a terrible cost. The cost, she realized, was the life of the person performing the ritual. Or perhaps, she thought, the ritual had trapped something, not summoned it, something that now sought release. She also learned more about Principal Vance. She was not just a strict disciplinarian, but a woman deeply involved in the occult, obsessed with the idea of immortality, of transcending the boundaries between the living and the dead. Rumors circulated that she had performed the ritual herself, sacrificing a student to gain access to the spirit world. The student, Emily realized with a chill, might have been the one who originally occupied room 428. Armed with this knowledge, Emily felt a surge of determination. She wouldn't be a victim. She would fight back. She would break the cycle of fear and death that had consumed room 428 for so long. That night, she returned to the room, not with fear, but with a plan. She had gathered several items from the library, objects that she believed were connected to the ritual. A silver locket, a dried sprig of lilac, a piece of parchment with strange symbols drawn on it. She also had a small vial of holy water, borrowed from a friend who was studying to be a priest. She arranged the objects on her desk, took a deep breath, and began to speak. She recited the incantations she had found in the old books, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger as she continued. The scent of lilacs filled the room, the air grew cold, and the knocking started again, louder now, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Suddenly, the figure materialized in the shadows, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. It raised its hand, pointing at her, its lips moving. forming words that Emily couldn't understand. But she could feel the power emanating from it, a wave of pure malevolence that threatened to overwhelm her. She held up the vial of holy water and threw it at the figure. The vial shattered against its chest, and the figure recoiled, hissing in pain. The scent of lilacs began to dissipate, replaced by the smell of burning sulfur. The figure stumbled backward, its form flickering, dissolving into the shadows. Emily didn't stop. She continued to recite the incantations, her voice growing stronger, her resolve hardening. She knew she was close. She could feel it. The figure was weakening, its power waning. Finally, with a last, desperate cry, she threw the silver locket at the wall. It struck the same spot where the knocking had always come from. There was a blinding flash of light, a deafening roar, and then silence. The scent of lilacs was gone. The figure was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily stood there, panting, her body trembling, the remnants of fear still clinging to her like a shroud. She looked around the room, half expecting the figure to reappear, but it was gone, truly gone. The oppressive weight that had filled the room for so long had lifted, replaced by an eerie calm. She cautiously approached the wall where the locket had struck. A small crack ran through the faded wallpaper, revealing a glimpse of something underneath. Curiosity overriding her fear, she peeled back the wallpaper, revealing a small, wooden box. Inside the box, she found several items: a lock of dark hair, a dried lilac blossom, a small, leather-bound book filled with strange symbols, and a tarnished silver key. Emily recognized the symbols from the parchment she had used in the ritual. This, she realized, must have been Principal Vance's box, the repository of her dark secrets, the key to her power. She opened the book, carefully turning the fragile pages. The writing was in a language she didn't recognize, but the illustrations were chilling. They depicted scenes of ritual sacrifice, demonic figures, and a terrifying entity that resembled the figure she had seen in the shadows. This was it, she thought, the source of the evil that had haunted room 428 for so long. She took the lock of hair and the dried lilac blossom and, with a sense of finality, threw them into the trash can. Then, she closed the box, placed it back in the wall, and carefully smoothed the wallpaper over it, concealing it once more. She didn't know if it would truly contain the entity, but it felt like the right thing to do. The silver key, however, she kept. She didn't know what it unlocked, but she felt compelled to keep it, a reminder of what she had faced, of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the ordinary. The rest of the semester passed without incident. The knocking stopped, the scent of lilacs vanished, and an uneasy peace settled over room 428. Sarah, oblivious as ever, continued her carefree college life, while Emily tried to move on, to forget the terrifying events of that first semester. But some things, she learned, are not so easily forgotten. The memory of the figure, its cold eyes, its whispered threats, remained etched in her mind. The key she kept in her drawer served as a constant reminder of the supernatural world that existed just beyond the veil of reality. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled outside her window, she would catch a faint whiff of lilacs, a fleeting reminder of the terror she had faced in room 428. A reminder that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. Years later, Emily would return to Ohio University, drawn back to Wilson Hall, to room 428. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was a need to confront her fears, to revisit the place where her life had irrevocably changed. She stood outside the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She hesitated for a moment, then reached for the doorknob. As she opened the door, she was met with a wave of nostalgia. The room looked the same: the faded wallpaper, the peeling paint, the twin beds pushed against the walls. But something was different. The air felt lighter, the oppressive presence was gone. She walked over to the spot on the wall where the knocking had always come from and touched the wallpaper. She could still feel the faint outline of the box beneath. She closed her eyes, remembering the ritual, the figure, the fear. And then she smiled. She had faced her demons, and she had survived. The room was no longer haunted, not by the entity, anyway, but the memory of what had happened there, the chilling reminder of the supernatural that would stay with her, always. It was a part of her story now, a dark chapter in her life that had ultimately made her stronger. As she turned to leave, she noticed something glinting on the floor near the closet. She bent down and picked it up. It was a small, silver key. Her key, the one she thought she had kept. But this key was different. It was older, tarnished, and it had a strange symbol engraved on it. A symbol she recognized from the book she had found in the wall. A symbol of something else. A chill ran down her spine. She looked back at the room, at the walls, at the shadows, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that her story was not over. The door to the supernatural was still open, and somewhere, something was waiting. The Busby chair. The biting Yorkshire wind howled a mournful dirge around the old barn, rattling the warped wooden shutters that clung precariously to the grimy windows. Inside, a thick layer of dust coated everything, undisturbed for decades. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, a testament to years of neglect. In the center of the barn, bathed in a sliver of moonlight filtering through a crack in the roof, sat a chair. Not just any chair, but a heavy, imposing armchair crafted from dark, gnarled oak. Its high back was intricately carved with grotesque faces, their features twisted in perpetual agony. The armrests, worn smooth by countless hands, ended in clawed feet that seemed to grip the floor like talons. This was Thomas Busby's chair. The legend surrounding the chair was well known in the area, whispered in hushed tones in the local pubs. Thomas Busby, a notorious highwayman in the late 17th century, was said to have committed a particularly brutal murder. Before his execution in 1702, Busby, in a fit of rage and defiance, cursed his favorite chair. He declared that anyone who dared to sit in it would meet their demise within 24 hours. Superstition, fueled by a string of unfortunate events, cemented the chair's dark reputation. The chair had passed through many hands over the centuries, each owner seemingly oblivious to its sinister history, or perhaps dismissive of the local folklore. Tragedy followed each possessor. A farmer who used it for his midday naps was found dead in his fields, gored by his own bull. A pub owner who proudly displayed it in his establishment died in a fire that mysteriously engulfed his inn. The stories multiplied, each more chilling than the last. The chair became a pariah, shunned by all but the most foolhardy. Eventually, it found its way into the cellar of a local museum, more a curiosity than a valued artifact. The museum curator, a pragmatic man named Alastair Finch, dismissed the tales as mere superstition. He saw the chair as a piece of history, a relic of a bygone era. Yet, even he felt a prickle of unease whenever he ventured near it. The chair seemed to exude a palpable aura of malice, a silent testament to the dark energy it was said to hold. One stormy night, Alastair found himself working late in the museum. The wind howled outside, mimicking the cries of lost souls, and the rain lashed against the windows like an angry mob. He was alone, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of an antique clock in the hallway. He decided to take a break from his paperwork and wandered down to the cellar. The air grew colder as he descended the stone steps, the smell of damp earth intensifying. He reached the cellar and switched on the flickering fluorescent light. The chair sat in the center of the room, shrouded in shadows. Alastair felt an inexplicable pull towards it, a morbid curiosity that he couldn't resist. He told himself it was just a chair, a piece of wood, but deep down, he knew there was something more to it, something dark and malevolent. He circled the chair, examining its intricate carvings. The grotesque faces seemed to leer at him, their eyes following his every move. He ran his hand over the smooth, worn armrests, feeling a strange, tingling sensation. He scoffed at his own nervousness. "It's just a chair," he muttered to himself, trying to dispel the growing unease. But the air in the cellar felt thick and heavy, charged with an unseen energy. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was lurking in the shadows. He decided to leave the cellar, telling himself he needed a cup of tea to warm his chilled bones. As he turned to go, he caught a glimpse of something in the corner of his eye. He turned back to the chair, or rather, to where the chair had been. It was gone. His heart pounded in his chest. He scanned the cellar, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The chair was nowhere to be seen. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He knew he hadn't imagined it. He had seen the chair, just moments ago. He stumbled back up the stairs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He burst into his office, slamming the door behind him. He leaned against the door, his heart still racing. He tried to rationalize what he had seen. It must have been his imagination, playing tricks on him in the dimly lit cellar. But deep down, he knew the truth. The chair was not just an ordinary object. It was something else, something far more sinister. Alistair, shaken but trying to maintain a semblance of rationality, poured himself a stiff drink. He told himself he was overtired, stressed from work. The disappearing chair, he reasoned, was a trick of the light, a figment of his imagination fueled by the chair's ominous reputation. He knew he should probably inform the museum director about the incident, but a strange sense of dread held him back. He feared ridicule, the knowing glances and whispered jokes about the curator who'd finally succumbed to local legends. He decided to keep the night's events to himself, attributing it to his weary state. The following days were unsettling. Alistair found himself constantly drawn to the cellar, an uneasy fascination pulling him back to the source of his fear. He'd descend the stone steps, flashlight in hand, half expecting, half dreading to find the chair in its usual place. It always was, sitting innocently in the dim light, its carved faces seemingly mocking his unease. Yet, the feeling of being watched persisted, a constant prickle on the back of his neck. He started having nightmares. He'd dream of the chair, the grotesque faces contorting in silent screams, the clawed feet reaching out to grab him. He'd wake in a cold sweat. The image of the chair burned into his mind. His colleagues noticed a change in him. The usually jovial Alistair had become withdrawn, irritable. He'd snap at them for no reason, his once sharp wit replaced by a brooding silence. He avoided the cellar, delegating any tasks related to the artifacts stored there to other staff members. But even in his office, surrounded by the familiar clutter of his research materials, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The chair was always on his mind, a dark presence lurking in the back of his consciousness. One afternoon, a group of school children visited the museum. Alistair, against his better judgment, found himself leading the tour. He steered them away from the cellar, making up excuses about renovations and restricted access. But as they passed the door leading downstairs, one of the children, a bright-eyed boy named Thomas, stopped and pointed. "What's down there?" he asked, his voice echoing in the quiet hallway. Alistair hesitated, then reluctantly opened the door. He switched on the light, revealing the stone steps leading down into the darkness. "It's just storage," he said, trying to sound casual. But Thomas wasn't convinced. He peered into the darkness, his eyes wide with curiosity. "It's spooky," he whispered. "Can we go down?" The other children chimed in, eager to explore the forbidden cellar. Alistair knew he couldn't refuse. He led them down the steps, his heart pounding in his chest. As they reached the bottom, he kept the group away from the corner where the chair resided. He showed them some old farming tools, explaining their historical significance. But Thomas kept wandering off, his attention drawn to the shadows. Suddenly, he stopped dead in his tracks. "Look!" he exclaimed, pointing to a dark corner. Alistair's blood ran cold. He knew what Thomas had seen. The chair. It wasn't supposed to be there. He had made sure it was covered and tucked away, out of sight. But there it was, sitting in the shadows, its carved faces leering at them. The children gasped, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Thomas, ever the curious one, took a step closer. "It's a scary chair," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Alistair grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Don't touch it," he said, his voice sharp. He ushered the children back up the stairs, his mind racing. How had the chair gotten there? He had checked it himself just that morning. It had been securely covered and placed in the back corner. He felt a wave of panic wash over him. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the chair was not just an inanimate object. It was something more, something malevolent, and it was targeting him. That night, Alistair's nightmares intensified. He dreamt that he was tied to the chair, the grotesque faces leering at him, their eyes burning into his soul. He could feel the cold, hardwood against his skin, the rough carvings digging into his flesh. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The faces grew closer, their features twisting in silent mockery. He woke up screaming, his body drenched in sweat. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The chair was a curse, a dark force that was slowly consuming him. He had to find a way to break the curse, to free himself from its grip. The next morning, Alistair went to the local library, determined to learn everything he could about Thomas Busby and his cursed chair. He spent hours poring over old books, searching for any clues, any information that could help him. He discovered that Busby was not just a highwayman, but also a rumored practitioner of dark arts. The curse, it was said, was not just a fit of rage, but a carefully crafted spell, imbued with dark energy. Alistair also learned about the various people who had died after sitting in the chair, their deaths all shrouded in strange and mysterious circumstances. He felt a growing sense of dread. He was trapped in a web of dark history, a prisoner of a curse that had claimed countless lives. He returned to the museum, his heart heavy with fear. He went straight to the cellar, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The chair was there, waiting for him, its presence more menacing than ever. He circled it cautiously, his eyes scanning every detail. He noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small inscription carved into the back of the chair, hidden amongst the grotesque faces. He leaned closer, trying to decipher the strange symbols. As he finally made out the words, a chill ran down his spine. It was a Latin phrase, a chilling invocation. Sedet ca in hoc loco, mortem sibi invocat. Whoever sits in this place calls death upon himself. Alistair knew then that he was in grave danger. The curse was real, and it was targeting him. He had to find a way to break it before it was too late. But how could he fight a curse that had been in place for centuries, a curse fueled by dark magic? He felt a sense of despair wash over him. He was alone, trapped in a battle against an unseen enemy, a malevolent force that was slowly tightening its grip on his soul. Alistair, his mind reeling from the chilling Latin inscription, knew he was in a desperate race against time. He had to break the curse before its 24-hour deadline claimed him. He returned to the library, his movements frantic, driven by a primal fear. He delved deeper into the occult, seeking any knowledge of curse reversal rituals. He discovered that curses, especially those imbued with dark magic like Busby's, were notoriously difficult to break. They required specific counter-rituals, often involving elements related to the curse's origin. He learned that Busby, besides being a highwayman, was rumored to have dabbled in dark pagan practices. This gave Alistair a glimmer of hope. He focused his research on ancient pagan rituals, particularly those practiced in the region during the 17th century. He discovered that oak, the very wood of the chair, held significant symbolism in pagan traditions, often associated with strength, longevity, but also with the darker aspects of nature. He also learned about the use of specific herbs and incantations in banishing rituals. Armed with this information, Alistair returned to the museum. He knew he had to act quickly. He gathered the necessary materials. Oak leaves gathered from an ancient tree in the nearby woods, representing the connection to the chair's origin. White candles, symbolizing purity and protection. And a small bowl of salt, representing earth and grounding. He also found a book of ancient incantations, written in a language he barely understood, but he hoped he could decipher enough to be of use. He descended to the cellar, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread. The chair sat in its usual spot, its presence radiating a chilling malevolence. Alistair laid out his materials on the floor, forming a circle around the chair. He lit the white candles, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He began the ritual, scattering the oak leaves around the chair. Their earthy scent a stark contrast to the musty air of the cellar. He then sprinkled salt around the perimeter of the circle, creating a protective barrier. He opened the book of incantations, his eyes scanning the strange symbols. He began to read aloud, his voice trembling at first, but growing stronger as he continued. The words were ancient, their meaning obscured, but their power was undeniable. As he spoke, the air in the cellar grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy. The flames of the candles flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the walls. Alistair felt a cold presence, a dark force pushing against his protective circle. He could sense the chair's malevolence, its anger at being challenged. He continued the incantation, his voice rising in a crescendo. He felt a tingling sensation in his hands, a strange energy flowing through him. The chair began to shake, its carved faces contorting in silent screams. The cellar grew colder, the air thick with a palpable sense of fear. Alistair knew he was close. He could feel the curse weakening, its grip loosening. He focused all his energy, all his will, into the final words of the incantation. As he spoke the last word, a blinding flash of light filled the cellar. Alistair shielded his eyes, momentarily blinded. When he opened them, he saw that the candles had been extinguished, plunging the cellar into darkness. He fumbled for his flashlight, his heart pounding in his chest. He switched it on, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. He looked towards the chair. It was still there, but something had changed. The malevolent aura that had surrounded it was gone. The chair seemed quieter, its presence less threatening. Alistair cautiously approached the chair. He ran his hand over the smooth, worn armrests, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. The curse was broken. He had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. He knew the chair would forever hold its dark history, but its power over him was gone. He had broken the cycle of fear, the chain of death that had bound so many to its malevolent influence. He left the cellar, a sense of peace settling over him. He knew he would never forget his ordeal, the chilling encounter with the cursed chair, but he also knew that he had faced his fears and emerged stronger. He had stared into the face of darkness and found the strength to overcome it. The next day, Alistair returned to the cellar, not with fear, but with a sense of closure. He looked at the chair, no longer a symbol of terror, but a reminder of his own resilience. He decided to move the chair from the cellar, displaying it in a well-lit area of the museum. Its story told not as a warning, but as a testament to the power of human courage and the enduring strength of the human spirit. He knew that the legend of Thomas Busby's chair would live on, but its power to instill fear, its ability to claim lives, was finally broken. The curse was lifted, the darkness banished. Whispers of Anjikuni Lake. The biting wind whipped across the desolate landscape of northern Canada, carrying with it the whispers of forgotten legends and the chill of the unknown. It was November 1930, a time when the harsh Canadian winter was beginning its icy grip on the land. A small group of university students, eager to explore the remote and sparsely populated regions, embarked on an expedition led by their anthropology professor, Dr. Alastair Finch. Their destination: a small Inuit village nestled near the shores of Lake Anjikuni, a lake shrouded in local folklore and whispered to be a place of strange occurrences. The students, a mix of eager undergraduates and seasoned graduate researchers, were drawn to the area by Dr. Finch's tales of the unique Inuit culture that thrived there. He spoke of their intricate knowledge of the land, their rich oral traditions, and their deep connection to the spirit world. The village, though remote, was known to be a welcoming community, often trading with and assisting travelers passing through their isolated region. Their journey was arduous, traversing miles of snow-covered wilderness by dog sled. The landscape was starkly beautiful, a vast expanse of white under a perpetually gray sky. The silence was profound, broken only by the howling wind and the rhythmic padding of the dog's paws. As they approached the village, a sense of unease began to settle over the group. The air felt heavy, the silence more profound than usual. The village came into view, a cluster of igloos and a few more permanent structures built from stone and timber. Smoke should have been rising from chimneys, and the sounds of daily life should have been echoing through the crisp air. But there was nothing. An unnerving stillness hung over the village, a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Dr. Finch, a man of considerable experience in the region, felt a prickle of unease. He had visited this village several times before, always greeted with warmth and hospitality. This deserted scene was unlike anything he had ever encountered. He urged the students to remain calm and cautious as they approached the nearest dwelling. The first igloo they entered was eerily undisturbed. A pot of stew hung over a cold hearth, the remnants of a meal long finished. Tools lay scattered about, as if their owners had simply stepped away for a moment. A lamp stood on a small table, its wick trimmed but unlit. Everything was in its place, yet the life that should have filled the dwelling was absent. As they explored further, they found the same unsettling scene repeated in every igloo and dwelling. Meals were left unfinished, tools were abandoned, and lamps stood ready to be lit. It was as if time had frozen in the village, capturing a moment of everyday life, but leaving its inhabitants vanished into thin air. The sense of unease deepened into something more akin to dread as they discovered that not only had the villagers disappeared, but even the graves in the small cemetery outside the village had been disturbed. The earth had been dug up, and the burial mounds were empty. The silence of the village was now punctuated by the frantic beating of their hearts. Where had everyone gone? What could have caused such a sudden and complete disappearance? The mystery of Lake Anjikuni had just deepened, and the students and their professor were now at the heart of it. The sun began its descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the deserted village. A biting wind picked up, swirling snow around the silent igloos and creating an eerie, whispering sound that seemed to carry the echoes of the missing villagers. Dr. Finch, his face grim, knew they couldn't stay in the open much longer. The harsh Arctic night would soon envelop them, and the strange stillness of the village held a growing sense of menace. He gathered the students, their faces pale and etched with worry. "We need to find shelter," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor of fear he felt inside. "And we need to try and understand what happened here." They chose the largest structure in the village, a communal dwelling built from stone and timber. It was more substantial than the igloos and offered better protection from the elements. Inside, they found a large central room with a massive hearth. Though the fire was long dead, the embers still held a faint warmth. They gathered wood and soon had a crackling fire going, casting flickering light that danced across the walls, creating grotesque shapes that played tricks on their already frayed nerves. As the firelight flickered, they noticed something peculiar. On the walls, etched into the stone and wood, were strange symbols. They were unlike anything Dr. Finch had ever seen, not resembling any known Inuit writing or iconography. The symbols were a series of circles and lines, intertwined in complex patterns. They seemed to pulse in the firelight, taking on a life of their own. One of the students, a young woman named Sarah, shivered. "They're watching us," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Dr. Finch tried to reassure her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the symbols were more than just decorations. They felt like a message, a warning, or perhaps even a key to the mystery that had unfolded before them. As the night deepened, the wind howled outside, and the silence of the village pressed in on them, heavy and suffocating. They tried to piece together what might have happened. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of an attack. It was as if the villagers had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. The disturbed graves added another layer of mystery. Why would anyone dig up the graves? What could they have been looking for? The thought sent a chill down their spines. They took turns keeping watch throughout the night, their eyes constantly scanning the shadows, their ears straining for any sound other than the wind and the crackling fire. The silence, however, remained unbroken, except for the occasional creak of the old house. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence that hinted at something terrifying and inexplicable. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky with a pale, icy light, they decided to venture out again. They needed to find some clue, some sign of where the villagers had gone. They explored the surrounding area, following the tracks of the dog sleds that had brought them to the village. The tracks led them to the edge of the lake, where they abruptly stopped. There was no sign of the villagers beyond that point. The lake itself was a dark, still expanse, its surface frozen solid. A sense of dread washed over them as they stared out at the icy wasteland. It was as if the lake had swallowed the villagers whole, leaving no trace of their existence. They returned to the village, their hopes dwindling. The mystery of Lake Angikuni seemed to be growing deeper, more impenetrable. As they stood in the deserted village, the strange symbols on the walls seemed to mock them, their silent message taunting them with the unknown. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the whispers of the departed, the echoes of a vanished people. The mystery remained, a chilling testament to the unknown forces that lurked in the vast, desolate wilderness of the north. The weight of the unknown pressed heavily upon the group as they huddled within the communal dwelling. The fire, now reduced to glowing embers, cast dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. Dr. Finch, his usually jovial face etched with worry, stared into the flames, his mind racing to make sense of the inexplicable. The students, a mix of apprehension and morbid curiosity, exchanged uneasy glances, the silence punctuated only by the crackling of the dying fire and the howling wind outside. "We have to consider all possibilities," Dr. Finch finally said, breaking the oppressive quiet. "There's no sign of a struggle, no indication of an attack. It's as if they simply vanished. But where could they have gone?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "And why would they leave everything behind?" No one had an answer. The village was a snapshot of life frozen in time, a tableau of everyday existence abruptly interrupted. The unfinished meals, the abandoned tools, the unlit lamps, all spoke of a sudden, unforeseen departure. The disturbed graves added another layer of complexity to the puzzle. It wasn't just the disappearance of the villagers. It was the violation of their final resting place. What could have motivated such an act? Were the two events connected? As the hours passed, the students began to speculate, their imaginations running wild with theories. Some whispered of ancient spirits and forgotten legends, tales Dr. Finch had shared with them around campfires during their journey. Others spoke of wild animals or natural disasters, though neither seemed to fit the circumstances. Dr. Finch, a man of science and reason, tried to steer the conversation towards more logical explanations. He spoke of the harsh realities of life in the Arctic, the dangers of blizzards and starvation. But even he couldn't dismiss the unsettling feeling that something more sinister was at play. The strange symbols etched on the walls of the dwelling continued to intrigue and disturb them. They photographed the symbols, hoping to decipher their meaning later. The intricate patterns seemed to hold a secret, a hidden message that could unlock the mystery of the vanished villagers. As darkness fell again, a renewed sense of dread settled over the group. The wind howled outside, its mournful cry echoing through the deserted village. The silence, when the wind momentarily subsided, was even more terrifying, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered all hope. They decided to keep watch in shifts again, their eyes constantly scanning the shadows, their ears straining for any sound. But the only sounds were the wind, the crackling embers, and the beating of their own hearts. During one of the quiet shifts, a student named David, a keen observer, noticed something peculiar about the symbols. He realized that the symbols seemed to align with certain constellations in the night sky. He pointed this out to Dr. Finch, who, upon closer inspection, confirmed David's observation. This discovery added a new dimension to the mystery. Could the symbols be a celestial map? Did they point to something beyond the earthly realm? The implications were both fascinating and terrifying. As the night wore on, the students' fears grew. They felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that they were being watched, that something unseen was lurking just beyond the edge of their perception. The silence of the village was no longer just empty. It felt pregnant with something malevolent. They huddled closer to the dying embers, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. The wind howled outside, carrying with it the whispers of the departed, the echoes of a vanished people. The mystery of Lake Anjikuni remained, a chilling testament to the unknown forces that lurked in the vast, desolate wilderness of the north, a reminder of the fragility of human existence in the face of the unseen current that flowed beneath the surface of reality. The Montauk Abomination. The morning of July 12, 2008, was like any other for the early beachgoers of Ditch Plains, a popular surf spot in Montauk, New York. The waves rolled in lazily, the salty air hung thick, and the sun glowed hazy through the morning mist. But something was different that day. Something was wrong. It was a jogger who found it first. She had been running along the shoreline when she stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. There, lying half buried in the damp sand, was something she had never seen before. A creature, bloated and discolored from the water. It had the body of something mammalian, but the beak of a bird. Its skin was leathery, like that of a reptile, but it had patches of what seemed like fur. Clawed limbs protruded stiffly, its flesh stretched unnaturally, as if it had been stitched together from different animals. The woman stumbled backward and let out a sharp gasp. Nearby, a group of teenagers ran over, drawn by her reaction. One of them took a picture. Within hours, the image spread across the internet, igniting a wildfire of speculation. Some claimed it was a hoax, a decayed raccoon, or a sea turtle without its shell. Others whispered about the nearby Plum Island Animal Disease Center, a government research facility just a few miles offshore. Conspiracy theorists had long speculated about what went on there. Stories of genetic experiments, biological warfare, and secret projects gone wrong. Was this thing evidence of something far more sinister? The authorities arrived quickly, too quickly. By noon, men in unmarked black SUVs had sealed off the beach, forcing onlookers away. The creature was whisked away before any official statement could be made. No one knew where it was taken, and any attempts to contact local officials about the body were met with silence. But something strange lingered in the air that day. An unease, a feeling that something had been uncovered that was never meant to be seen. And the sightings didn't stop. A week later, a fisherman swore he saw another one, alive. The fisherman, Robert Calloway, had spent most of his life on the waters around Montauk. He knew every tide, every rock formation, every hidden cove. But what he saw that evening would haunt him for the rest of his days. It was just past sunset when Robert took his small fishing boat out beyond the usual spots. The water was calm, the sky a deepening purple. As he cast his line, the rhythmic sound of the waves soothed him, and for a moment, everything felt normal. Then he heard it, a wet, sloshing noise, followed by something scraping against the hull of his boat. Robert froze, his hands tightening around the fishing rod. He peered over the edge, expecting to see a large fish or maybe a tangle of seaweed caught against the side. But what he saw instead made his stomach twist. Just below the water's surface, something moved. The shape was murky, distorted by the shifting current, but he could make out the outline of a body, long and bloated, with thin, clawed limbs that jerked unnaturally. The head, it was wrong. The flesh looked like it had been stripped away in places, exposing raw muscle and bone. And then there were the eyes. They were open, staring. Robert scrambled backward, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. He grabbed the flashlight from his bag and shone it into the water. The moment the beam hit the creature, it reacted. It moved fast, too fast. A clawed limb shot out, slamming against the side of the boat with enough force to send ripples through the water. Robert staggered, nearly losing his footing. He could hear it breathing, ragged, wet gasps, like something that had been drowning but refused to die. His instinct screamed at him to run. With shaking hands, he yanked the engine cord, and the motor sputtered to life. As the boat lurched forward, he dared one last glance at the water. The creature was gone. Robert sped back to shore, his mind racing. He had to tell someone, but who would believe him? The authorities had already covered up the first creature, and if there was another one? He docked his boat and rushed to find his friend, Charlie, a retired marine biologist who had spent years studying Montauk's waters. When Robert finally arrived at Charlie's house, breathless and pale, the old man listened in silence. Then, without a word, he walked to a locked cabinet and pulled out a weathered folder. Inside were old newspaper clippings, grainy black and white photos, and classified reports, some dating back to the 1950s. "Robert," Charlie said grimly, tapping one of the documents, "this isn't the first time something like this has happened." Robert's hands trembled as he sifted through the old documents spread across Charlie's kitchen table. The papers were yellowed with age, some stamped with classified in bold red ink. Faded photographs showed strange carcasses, half decayed, washed up on the beaches of Long Island. The descriptions in the reports were disturbingly familiar. Bloated bodies, exposed muscle, unnatural limbs. This has happened before? Robert stammered, looking up at Charlie. The old man sighed, rubbing his temple. "More times than you'd think. The government always cleans it up before the public gets too suspicious. But they can't erase everything." Robert flipped to an old newspaper article from 1967. The headline read, "Mysterious SEA creature discovered near Montauk. Authorities deny claims." The accompanying photo was grainy, but the shape was eerily similar to what had washed up in 2008. Charlie pulled out another file, this one filled with reports from Plum Island. "You know about Plum Island, don't you?" Charlie asked, his voice low. Robert nodded. Everyone around Montauk had heard the rumors. The government facility was supposedly focused on animal disease research, but locals whispered about far darker experiments: genetic manipulation, biological testing, even human-animal hybrids. Charlie tapped one of the documents. These reports mention Project Aegis, an experiment from the Cold War era. The theory was that they were trying to engineer biological weapons, creatures that could survive in any environment, resistant to disease, able to adapt to anything. Robert's stomach twisted. "You're saying the thing I saw, it's one of theirs?" Charlie hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know. If it was, it should have died decades ago. But what if?" He swallowed hard, his expression darkening. "What if it didn't?" The thought sent a chill down Robert's spine. "What do we do?" Robert asked. "We can't just pretend this isn't happening." Charlie sighed and stood up. "I have one more person you need to talk to." That night, Robert followed Charlie deep into Montauk's backroads, past quiet houses and abandoned buildings. They finally stopped at a rundown shack near the edge of the woods. Charlie knocked on the door. A long silence followed before it creaked open, revealing a woman in her 60s, her piercing blue eyes scanning them with suspicion. "Charlie," she said flatly, You shouldn't have come. Mary, Charlie replied, his voice serious. He saw it. The woman stiffened. For a moment, Robert thought she was going to slam the door in their faces. Instead, she stepped aside and let them in. Inside, the house was cluttered with books, maps, and stacks of old government files. Mary sat them down and poured a glass of whiskey for herself, skipping the pleasantries. I used to work at Plum Island, she said, her voice heavy. Back in the 80s. Robert leaned in. And Mary exhaled slowly, staring into her glass. I was part of a research team studying genetic anomalies. Things they never should have been messing with. But one project went too far. She reached into a locked drawer and pulled out a faded black and white photo. It showed a tank filled with murky liquid. Floating inside was something inhuman. They called it Specimen 14. Mary's voice was barely a whisper. Robert stared at the photo, his pulse pounding. The shape inside the tank. It had the same features as the thing he had seen in the water. But that thing is dead, right? Robert asked, his voice almost pleading. Mary didn't answer right away. Then, finally, she said, it was. Until it wasn't. Robert's mouth went dry as he stared at the grainy photograph. The creature inside the tank, Specimen 14, looked nearly identical to what he had seen beneath the water. Charlie was the first to break the silence. What do you mean, until it wasn't? Mary set her glass down and rubbed a hand over her face. Plum Island wasn't just about studying animal diseases. They were pushing the limits of genetic engineering, splicing DNA from different species, seeing how far they could go. She hesitated, but Specimen 14 was different. We didn't just mix animal DNA. There was something else in it. Robert felt a deep, instinctual fear take hold of him. Something else? Mary's fingers tightened around the edges of the photograph. We never knew exactly what it was. The higher-ups wouldn't tell us. They just called it an organic anomaly, something recovered from deep-sea trenches. It wasn't alive when they found it, at least not in the way we understand life. Robert shivered. The ocean was vast and largely unexplored. Who knew what ancient horrors lurked in its depths? Specimen 14 was the only one that survived the experiments, Mary continued. It grew faster than we anticipated. It adapted. Then, one night, the power went out in the lab. The backup generators failed. By the time the lights came back on, Specimen 14's tank was shattered. Robert swallowed hard. And what happened to it? Mary exhaled. We assumed it died. The lab was near the water, and when we searched the facility, all we found were deep claw marks and a hole in the side of the building. The higher-ups ordered a total cover-up. They burned records, erased files. Everyone was reassigned, and we were told to forget it ever existed. She looked at Robert now, her expression grim. But it didn't die, did it? Robert shook his head. Mary leaned back, looking as though she had just aged 10 years. If it survived this long, it means it's still evolving, adapting, and if it's close to shore again, she didn't need to finish. Robert's mind reeled. The bloated carcass that had washed up in 2008 had been decayed, broken down by time and exposure. But what if that wasn't the original? What if there were more? What do we do? He asked, his voice low. Mary hesitated, then stood. She crossed the room to a locked chest, pulling out a heavy-duty rifle and a worn-out duffel bag. We need to find it before the government does. Charlie frowned. You think they don't already know? Mary's eyes darkened. Oh, they know, but they don't want to stop it. Robert's stomach twisted. Then what do they want? Mary locked eyes with him. They want it back. A heavy silence filled the room. Robert could feel the weight of Mary's words pressing down on him. If the government wanted the creature back, it meant only one thing. It was never an accident. Charlie was the first to speak. You're telling me they let that thing escape? Mary shook her head. No, it got out on its own. But after we lost it, they realized something. She hesitated, as if choosing her next words carefully. It wasn't dying. It wasn't deteriorating like a normal organism. If anything, it was thriving. Robert felt a cold sweat forming at the base of his neck. Thriving how? Mary took a deep breath. It was evolving. Rapidly. We weren't dealing with a normal creature. It was learning, adapting to its surroundings, growing stronger. The longer it stayed in the wild, the less human science could control it. Charlie muttered a curse under his breath. And now that it's surfaced again, they want to contain it. Mary gave a grim nod. Or worse, weaponize it. A deep, suffocating unease settled over the room. The implications were too terrifying to ignore. If the government had been tracking this thing for decades, covering up its existence, how many times had it resurfaced without the public knowing? Robert clenched his fists. So what do? We can't just let it roam free. Mary zipped up the duffel bag and slung the rifle strap over her shoulder. We track it. Charlie scoffed. And then what? We can't kill it. Hell, the government couldn't even contain it. You think we're just gonna walk up to this thing and put a bullet in its head? Mary met his eyes with a steely gaze. If we can't kill it, we find out what does. Robert exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. He had spent his whole life as a simple fisherman. Now, he was preparing to hunt down a government-bred monstrosity. This wasn't what he had signed up for. But then he thought about the way that thing had looked at him in the water. Not like an animal, but like something that recognized him, that had studied him. And something told him that if they didn't act soon, it wouldn't be hiding anymore. It would be hunting them. Hours later, under the cover of darkness, they set out toward the water. Mary had spent years collecting reports on the creature's sightings, and she had a theory. It returned to Montauk because it was drawn to something. Whether it was instinct, a feeding pattern, or something more sinister, it kept surfacing in the same areas. Armed with tracking equipment, night vision goggles, and Mary's rifle, the three of them made their way to an isolated stretch of beach near the cliffs. The night was eerily quiet, too quiet. No waves, no wind, no animal sounds. Charlie frowned. I don't like this. Robert shivered, but ignored the growing sense of unease. He focused on the water, scanning for any sign of movement. The moon reflected off the calm surface, casting an unnatural stillness over the ocean. Then, a ripple. Mary stiffened. She raised her rifle, eyes narrowing. Something's out there. Robert followed her gaze. At first, he saw nothing, just dark water lapping against the shore. But then, slowly, something began to rise. A shape. At first, it looked like driftwood, long and bloated. But then he saw the limbs, thin, unnatural, clawed. The creature lifted its head, revealing a face that was barely recognizable as living flesh. Its exposed muscle gleamed wet under the moonlight, its dark, sunken eyes locked onto them. Robert felt his throat tighten. It was watching, studying. Charlie swore. Jesus Christ. The creature took a step forward, its body shifting in ways that shouldn't be possible, its flesh rippling as if still forming itself. And then, it opened its mouth. A sound unlike anything Robert had ever heard filled the air. A deep, guttural, almost human wail. The sound sent ice through his veins, his instinct screaming at him to run. But before he could move, the creature lunged. Straight for them. The creature lunged with inhuman speed, its twisted limbs propelling it forward in a jerking, unnatural motion. Robert barely had time to react. Move, Mary shouted. Robert dove to the side, just as the thing's clawed hand slammed into the sand where he had been standing, sending a spray of dirt and debris into the air. He scrambled backward, his heart hammering, eyes locked onto the monstrosity as it rose to its full height. Up close, it was even more horrifying. A grotesque fusion of flesh, bone, and something else, something unnatural. The gaping hole where its mouth should have been pulsed, emitting a wet, rattling sound. Mary raised her rifle and fired. The first shot hit its shoulder, but the creature barely flinched. The wound sealed almost instantly, as if its flesh were knitting itself back together. Charlie cursed. It's healing. How the hell do we stop this thing? The creature turned its head toward Mary, locking onto her. Then, it charged. She barely had time to react before it was on her, its claws slashing through the air. Mary threw herself backward, but the creature's hand caught the edge of her jacket, tearing through fabric as she hit the ground hard. Robert acted on instinct. He grabbed a nearby boat oar, swung it with all his strength, and cracked it against the creature's head. The wood splintered on impact. The monster recoiled, letting out an ear-splitting screech, but it didn't fall. Instead, its body seemed to ripple again, its form shifting, adapting. Then, its eyes landed on Robert. A deep, unsettling recognition flickered across its grotesque features. Robert's blood ran cold. It remembered him. The creature took a slow step forward, its breathing ragged, its body convulsing as if it were becoming something else. And that's when Mary pulled the trigger again, this time aiming for its head. The bullet struck the creature's skull, and for the first time, it let out a real cry of pain. The sound was unnatural, like 1,000 voices screaming at once. It stumbled back, its flesh writhing, its movements suddenly disoriented. Robert didn't hesitate. "The water!" he shouted. "Get it in the water!" Charlie's eyes widened in realization. It came from the ocean. Maybe that's where it's weakest. Mary didn't question it. She fired again, forcing the creature backward. Robert and Charlie rushed forward, using every ounce of strength to shove the thing toward the waves. The creature resisted, its claws digging into the sand, its distorted form shifting violently. But then, it hit the water. The moment its body submerged, a horrible, inhuman shriek filled the night. The creature convulsed violently, its flesh bubbling as if reacting to the salt. Robert watched, breathless, as the monster began to dissolve. Its body twisted and broke apart, the once solid flesh turning into something black and tar-like, sinking into the depths. And then it was gone. For a long time, none of them spoke. The waves lapped gently at the shore, as if nothing had happened, as if the nightmare had never existed. Finally, Charlie broke the silence. "Is it dead?" Mary exhaled, lowering her gun. "I don't know." Robert stared out at the dark ocean, his mind reeling. The thing had reacted to the salt water like it didn't belong there. Maybe it was never meant to leave the lab. Maybe it was a mistake that had been hiding all these years, only to finally be exposed. Or maybe it was just one of many. Mary turned to Robert. "If it's gone, the government will come looking for it. For us." Robert nodded. He knew too much now. They all did. Charlie sighed. "So what do we do?" Mary's expression hardened. "We disappear." And with that, they left the beach behind, knowing that some things should never be uncovered. But as Robert walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the creature hadn't been trying to kill him. It had been trying to communicate, and that terrified him more than anything. Because what if it wasn't alone? What if there were more, waiting? The Chase Vault's secret. The year is 1812. Barbados, a jewel of the British West Indies, basked in the tropical sun. But beneath the veneer of paradise, whispers of unease stirred, carried on the humid breeze like the scent of overripe fruit. These whispers centered on the Chase family vault, a seemingly impenetrable crypt nestled within the Christ Church Parish Cemetery. The Chase family, prominent landowners and figures of considerable social standing, were no strangers to tragedy. Their vault, a somber edifice of coral stone, was intended to be a final resting place of dignified permanence. However, it soon became a stage for the bizarre, a theater of the inexplicable. It began subtly, with whispers from the gravediggers. They spoke of finding the vault's heavy oak door, secured with a sturdy lock and seal, mysteriously ajar upon their routine visits. Initially, these incidents were dismissed as carelessness, a trick of the light. or the overactive imaginations of men who spent their days amongst the silent residents of the cemetery. But the incidents escalated. Not only was the door occasionally found open, but the heavy lead coffins within the vault were discovered to be in disarray. Massive, cumbersome caskets, far too heavy for any single man to move, were found shifted from their designated places. Some were overturned, their lids askew. Others were rearranged in seemingly deliberate patterns, as if some unseen hand had been conducting a macabre choreography. The whispers turned to murmurs, then to outright expressions of fear. The gravediggers, superstitious men in a superstitious age, spoke of duppies, the restless spirits of the dead, disturbed by the presence of the living. They spoke of malevolent forces at play, of a curse upon the Chase family. The rumors reached the ears of the Chase family themselves. Initially, they were dismissive, attributing the stories to the idle gossip of the lower classes. But as the incidents persisted, and as the evidence became undeniable, a disquiet began to settle upon them, a chill that no amount of Caribbean sunshine could dispel. The family patriarch, Colonel Thomas Chase, a man of stern countenance and unwavering practicality, was particularly troubled. He had commissioned the vault himself, a symbol of his family's enduring legacy. Now, it seemed to be mocking him, a stage for some macabre spectacle he couldn't comprehend. He ordered the vault to be secured with an even stronger lock, a heavy iron bar bolted across the door. He even stationed a guard at the cemetery overnight, a watchful presence to deter any would-be intruders. Yet, despite these precautions, the disturbances continued. Each time the vault was opened, the coffins were found in disarray, the heavy oak door and its formidable lock untouched. The mystery deepened, casting a pall over the entire island. Speculation ran rampant. Some whispered of supernatural intervention, of vengeful spirits and ancient curses. Others spoke of elaborate hoaxes, of secret passages and hidden mechanisms. But no logical explanation could be found. The Chase vault, solid and unyielding, held its secrets close, a silent testament to the inexplicable. The mystery of the moving coffins became a local legend, a chilling tale whispered in hushed tones in the taverns and marketplaces of Barbados. It was a story that spoke to the primal fear of the unknown, the unsettling realization that there are forces in the universe that defy human understanding. And the Chase family, caught in the center of this macabre drama, found themselves increasingly isolated, their once respected name now synonymous with the strange and the unsettling. The whispers followed them, a constant reminder of the mystery that haunted their family vault, a mystery that seemed to grow more sinister with each passing day. Colonel Thomas Chase, a man accustomed to command, found himself increasingly frustrated by the inexplicable events surrounding his family vault. The whispers, the rumors, the unsettling discoveries, they chipped away at his composure, eroding his sense of order and control. He was a man of logic, of reason, yet he was confronted with a phenomenon that defied all explanation. He doubled down on his efforts to understand the mystery, seeking counsel from experts, scholars, even the local parson. He scrutinized the vault's construction, searching for any hidden passage, any sign of tampering. He interviewed the gravediggers repeatedly, probing their stories for inconsistencies, for any hint of deception. But all his efforts yielded nothing but a deeper sense of bewilderment. Theories abounded. Some suggested that the shifting of the coffins was due to subterranean movements, tremors in the earth that subtly rearranged the heavy lead boxes. Others proposed that the dampness of the vault, combined with the weight of the coffins, caused the ground beneath them to shift and settle. But these theories failed to explain the undisturbed lock, the sealed door, the complete lack of any external evidence of natural disturbance. The colonel, a man of action, found himself trapped in a web of uncertainty. He felt a growing sense of responsibility for his family, a need to protect them not just from the physical mystery, but from the creeping dread that was beginning to consume them. His wife, Eliza, a woman of delicate sensibilities, was particularly affected. She spoke of nightmares, of shadowy figures moving within the vault, of whispers carried on the wind. The colonel decided to take matters into his own hands. He ordered the vault to be emptied completely. The coffins, each bearing the weight of a family member's earthly remains, were carefully removed and placed in a temporary holding area. The vault was then thoroughly inspected. Every inch of its stone walls, its floor, its ceiling, examined for any anomaly. Nothing. The vault was exactly as it should be, a solid, unyielding tomb. With the vault empty, the colonel hoped the disturbances would cease. He reasoned that whatever force was at work, it required the presence of the coffins to manifest. He was wrong. Even with the vault bare, the unsettling incidents continued. The door was still occasionally found ajar, the lock untouched. And now, a new element of the bizarre emerged. Small objects, personal items belonging to the deceased, a silver locket, a child's toy, a worn leather-bound book, began to appear inside the empty vault. These objects were not there before, and no one could explain how they got inside the locked chamber. The colonel's resolve began to waver. He was a man of science, a man of reason, yet he was confronted with a reality that defied all logic. He felt a growing sense of unease, a primal fear that crept into the corners of his mind, a fear of the unknown, the unseen, the inexplicable. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. The Chase family name, once synonymous with respect and prosperity, was now whispered with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The colonel felt himself becoming a pariah, isolated by the very mystery that haunted his family. He began to withdraw, spending long hours alone in his study, poring over books on the occult, on folklore, on anything that might offer a clue to the enigma of the Chase vault. He was desperate for answers, desperate for a way to restore order to his world, to silence the whispers that haunted his waking hours and invaded his dreams. But the answers remained elusive, hidden behind the unyielding stone of the Chase vault, a silent testament to the inexplicable. The Hornet's Curse. The year is 1943. The world is engulfed in the brutal dance of war, and the USS Hornet, a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier, slices through the Pacific waves, a steel behemoth carrying its own war within its hull. Even before its legendary role in World War II, the Hornet had earned a grim reputation amongst its crew. Whispers circulated in the mess halls and darkened corners of the ship, tales of unexplained accidents, of men driven to the brink, of a pervasive sense of unease that clung to the vessel like sea mist. The Hornet wasn't just a machine of war. It was a city at sea, housing thousands of souls. But it also became a stage for tragedy. Over 300 incidents, ranging from accidental deaths to suicides, stained the ship's log. Each loss, each desperate act, seemed to leave an imprint on the steel and bulkheads, a residue of suffering that clung to the very air. One sweltering night, a young recruit named Thomas found himself on watch duty in the lower decks. He was a farm boy from Kansas, barely out of his teens, and the claustrophobic confines of the ship, the constant thrum of the engines, and the stories he'd heard had him on edge. The air was thick with the smell of oil and metal, and a low, rhythmic groaning echoed through the corridors, the sound of the ship's immense structure flexing in the waves. Thomas patrolled his assigned area, his footsteps echoing in the near silence. He passed darkened storage rooms, their heavy doors sealed shut, and workshops where the tools of the ship's trade lay dormant. He tried to focus on his duties, but his mind kept drifting back to the stories: the sailor who had fallen from the mast, the officer who had shot himself in his cabin, the young man who had simply vanished, leaving behind only his neatly folded uniform. As he rounded a corner, Thomas noticed a faint light emanating from a nearby compartment. He approached cautiously, his hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight on his belt. The door to the compartment was slightly ajar, and he could hear a faint sound coming from within. It sounded like sobbing. Thomas hesitated. He knew he should investigate, but a knot of fear tightened in his stomach. He told himself it was probably just a homesick sailor, but the stories he'd heard, they made his heart pound in his chest. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The compartment was dimly lit by a single bare bulb, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. It was a small storage area, filled with crates and equipment, but it wasn't the contents of the room that made Thomas's blood run cold. In the far corner, sitting on the floor with his back to him, was a figure in a sailor's uniform. His shoulders were shaking, and Thomas could hear the muffled sobs. He approached cautiously, his flashlight beam dancing across the room. "Hey," Thomas said softly, "everything all right?" The figure didn't respond. He continued to sob, his body racked with grief. Thomas took another step closer. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. Still, no response. Thomas reached out and gently touched the sailor's shoulder. The figure stiffened and slowly turned his head. What Thomas saw in the dim light made him gasp. The sailor's face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and dark. His uniform was tattered and stained, and a dark, gaping wound was visible on his forehead. He opened his mouth, and a chilling whisper escaped his lips. "Help me." Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Thomas stumbled backward, his flashlight clattering to the floor. He scrambled out of the compartment, his heart pounding in his ears. He didn't stop running until he reached the main deck, where he collapsed, gasping for air. He tried to tell himself that he had imagined it, that it was just his nerves getting the better of him. But deep down, he knew what he had seen. He had seen the ghost of the USS Hornet. Thomas's encounter left him shaken to his core. He tried to rationalize what he'd seen, to dismiss it as a trick of the light, an overactive imagination fueled by the ship's unsettling atmosphere. But the image of the spectral sailor, the chilling whisper, remained seared into his mind. He confided in a few of his fellow recruits, but they just shrugged it off, attributing it to sea stories and the pressures of wartime service. They'd heard the tales, too, the rumors of the Hornet's haunted reputation, but most dismissed them as superstition. Yet, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled upon something real, something that went beyond the realm of logic and reason. He began to research the ship's history, poring over old logs and crew rosters, searching for any information about the men who had died aboard the Hornet. He discovered a disturbing pattern, a disproportionate number of accidents and suicides, often involving young sailors like himself. He learned about the ship's nickname, the Haunted Hornet, whispered among the crew in hushed tones. One name, in particular, caught his attention. Seaman Apprentice John Redacted. I've redacted the name, as I'm unsure if it's permissible to use real names from historical records in this context. If you'd like me to include a name, please let me know. Redacted had died in 1940, 3 years before Thomas joined the Navy, after falling from the ship's mast during a storm. The circumstances surrounding his death were unclear, with some rumors suggesting it wasn't an accident at all. As Thomas delved deeper, he discovered that Redacted had been assigned to a watch duty in the lower decks, the same area where Thomas had encountered the apparition. A chilling thought crept into his mind. Could the ghost he'd seen be that of Redacted? Driven by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, Thomas returned to the storage compartment where he'd had his encounter. He brought his flashlight with him and carefully examined the area. He noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small, wooden box tucked away in a corner, half hidden behind a stack of crates. He opened the box and found it contained a few personal items, a faded photograph of a young woman, a worn leather-bound journal, and a small, tarnished silver locket. He opened the locket and found another photograph inside, this one of a young sailor in a Navy uniform. It was redacted. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. He picked up the journal and began to read. The entries were written in a shaky hand, filled with loneliness, fear, and a growing sense of despair. Redacted wrote about the pressures of naval life, the constant danger, and the feeling of being trapped in the belly of the ship. He also mentioned a secret he was carrying, something he couldn't reveal to anyone. The last entry was chilling. I can't take it anymore. The ship, it's taken my soul. I see things that aren't real. I hear whispers in the dark. I feel a coldness that never leaves me. I need to tell someone, but who would believe me? Maybe this is the only way out. The entry ended abruptly. Thomas closed the journal, his hands trembling. He now knew the truth. The ghost he had seen was indeed Redacted. And he also knew that Redacted's death wasn't an accident. He had taken his own life, driven to despair by the horrors he had witnessed, both real and imagined, aboard the USS Hornet. But what was the secret Redacted had been carrying? And why was his spirit still trapped on the ship? Thomas knew he had to find out. He felt a strange sense of responsibility, a need to help Redacted find peace. But he also knew that the secrets of the USS Hornet were dark and dangerous, and that seeking them out could put him in grave danger. Thomas felt a chilling weight settle upon him. He was no longer just a young recruit. He was a confidant of a ghost, a seeker of the Hornet's hidden truths. He knew he couldn't simply ignore what he discovered. The journal, the locket, the spectral encounter. They were all pieces of a puzzle that spoke of a tragedy far deeper than he had imagined. He decided to confide in a seasoned sailor, a grizzled veteran named Miller, who had served on the Hornet for many years. Miller was known for his quiet demeanor and his knowledge of the ship's history, both official and unofficial. Thomas found him in the mess hall, nursing a cup of coffee and staring out at the churning sea. "Mr. Miller," Thomas began hesitantly, "can I talk to you about something?" Miller looked up, his eyes, weathered and wise, holding a hint of curiosity. "Sure, son. What's on your mind?" Thomas recounted his experience, the ghostly encounter, the discovery of Redacted's journal, and his growing suspicion that the sailor's death was not a simple accident. He expected Miller to dismiss his story as the ramblings of a young, impressionable recruit. But Miller listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each word. When Thomas finished, Miller was silent for a long moment. Then, he leaned forward, his voice low and grave. "You've stumbled onto something, son," he said. "Something that's been buried for a long time. The Hornet, she keeps her secrets close." Miller confirmed that he had heard stories about Redacted's death, but he also knew that there was more to the story than what was officially recorded. He told Thomas that Redacted had been investigating something himself, something that had made him nervous and withdrawn in the weeks leading up to his death. He talked about whispers, Miller said, whispers in the steel, he called them. He said he could hear the ship talking to him, telling him things, dark things. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. The whispers in the steel. Could that be the secret Redacted had alluded to in his journal? Miller warned Thomas to be careful. "There are things on this ship," he said, "things that are best left undisturbed. The Hornet, she doesn't like her secrets being dug up, and there are those who will do anything to keep them buried." Despite the warning, Thomas was determined to uncover the truth. He felt a connection to Redacted, a sense of obligation to help him find peace. He spent his free time exploring the ship, searching for any clues that might lead him to the answers he sought. He revisited the storage compartment, hoping to find something he had missed. He examined the journal again, looking for any hidden meanings or coded messages. He even tried to decipher the photograph of the young woman, hoping to identify her and learn more about Redacted's life. One day, while exploring a forgotten section of the lower decks, Thomas stumbled upon a hidden room. It was small and dusty, filled with old equipment and forgotten records. He found a stack of files labeled confidential. Inside, he discovered documents related to a series of strange incidents that had occurred on the Hornet in the years leading up to Redacted's death. The documents described strange noises, unexplained equipment malfunctions, and a series of disturbing accidents. They also mentioned reports of crew members experiencing hallucinations, nightmares, and a pervasive sense of dread. One report, in particular, caught Thomas's attention. It described a series of experiments conducted on the ship experiments involving sensory deprivation. Thomas's blood ran cold. Could this be the secret Redacted had been carrying? Had he stumbled upon something so disturbing that it had driven him to despair? As Thomas delved deeper into the files, he began to feel a presence, a coldness that seemed to emanate from the room itself. He heard whispers in the steel, just like Redacted had described. The whispers were faint, indistinct, but they seemed to be saying something chilling. "Leave," they whispered. "Leave now." Thomas knew he was in danger. He had uncovered something that the Hornet wanted to keep hidden, something that had claimed the life of Redacted and now threatened his own. But he was too close to the truth to turn back. He had to know what happened. He had to know why Redacted's spirit was still trapped on the ship. The whispers intensified, a chorus of chilling voices echoing in the confines of the hidden room. Thomas felt a pressure building in his head, a sense of disorientation that made it difficult to focus. He knew he had to get out of there, but the files, the secrets they held, kept him rooted to the spot. He forced himself to continue reading, his eyes scanning the documents, desperately trying to piece together the puzzle. The sensory deprivation experiments. They were conducted on volunteers from the crew, men who were isolated in darkened, soundproof chambers for extended periods. The aim, according to the reports, was to study the effects of sensory deprivation on the human mind. But the experiments had gone horribly wrong. The reports detailed cases of severe psychological distress, hallucinations, paranoia, and even catatonia. Some of the volunteers never fully recovered, their minds fractured beyond repair. And some had simply vanished, their fates unknown. Thomas realized with a growing sense of horror that Redacted had likely been one of these volunteers. He had been subjected to the experiments, his mind deliberately broken down, his senses manipulated, his perception of reality warped. The whispers in the steel, they weren't just a metaphor. They were the echoes of the tormented souls who had been subjected to the experiments, their voices trapped within the very structure of the ship. And Redacted, he hadn't just witnessed horrors, he had experienced them. He had been driven to madness, his spirit irrevocably damaged. His suicide wasn't an escape. It was a final, desperate act of surrender. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Leave now before they find you." Thomas knew he had to escape. He grabbed the files, shoving them into his jacket, and turned to flee. But as he reached the door, a figure materialized in front of him. It was a man in a navy uniform, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and dark. Redacted. Thomas stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The ghost raised a hand, pointing a trembling finger at Thomas. "You know too much," he whispered, his voice filled with pain and rage. Thomas wanted to scream, to run, but he was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. Redacted took a step closer, his spectral form flickering in the dim light. They don't want the truth to be revealed. Suddenly, the room went dark. Thomas felt a coldness envelop him, a sensation of being pulled into a void. He heard the whispers all around him, swirling and echoing in the darkness. "Join us," they whispered. "Become one of us." Thomas struggled against the pull, desperately trying to break free. He could feel his sanity slipping away, his mind being invaded by the tormented voices of the ship's victims. He thought of his family, his friends, the life he had left behind. He couldn't give up. He had to fight. With a surge of adrenaline, he managed to break free from the spectral grasp. He stumbled backward, his hand reaching out, grasping for something, anything. His fingers closed around a cold, metallic object, his flashlight. He switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. Redacted recoiled, his spectral form flickering and fading. Thomas didn't hesitate. He turned and fled, the whispers chasing him through the corridors of the ship. He didn't stop running until he reached the main deck, where he collapsed, gasping for air. He had escaped, but he knew he was no longer safe. The Hornet had revealed its secrets, and now it wanted to silence him. Thomas knew he couldn't stay on the Hornet. The ship was no longer just a vessel. It was a prison, a tomb, a malevolent entity that craved silence. He had glimpsed its dark heart, and now it wanted him silenced, just like it had silenced Redacted and countless others. But leaving wasn't going to be easy. The Hornet wouldn't let him go without a fight. He considered confiding in the captain, revealing the files, exposing the truth about the experiments. But a chilling thought stopped him. What if the captain was involved? What if the conspiracy went beyond the hidden room, reaching into the highest ranks of the ship's command? He couldn't trust anyone. He was alone. He decided to take matters into his own hands. He needed proof, something tangible that he could use to expose the truth. He knew the files he had taken were damning, but they weren't enough. He needed to find the location of the sensory deprivation chambers, the place where the horrors had occurred. He returned to Miller, the only person he felt he could trust. He showed him the files, explained what he had discovered. Miller's face grew grim as he read the documents. "This is worse than I imagined," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The experiments, they were whispered about, but no one dared to speak of them openly. The ship, she protects her own. Miller told Thomas that the sensory deprivation chambers were located in a sealed-off section of the lower decks, a place that had been abandoned years ago. He warned Thomas that it was a dangerous place, that the spirits of the victims were said to linger there, their pain and suffering echoing through the empty corridors. Thomas knew he had to go. He had to see the chambers for himself, to find the evidence he needed to expose the truth. He asked Miller to help him, but the old sailor shook his head. "I've served on this ship for too long," he said. "I've seen too much. I can't. I won't go back there." Thomas understood. He didn't blame Miller for his fear. He was afraid too, but he knew he had no choice. He was the only one who could stop the Hornet, who could give the tormented souls some measure of peace. That night, under the cover of darkness, Thomas made his way to the lower decks. He moved silently through the maze of corridors, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The air grew colder, the silence broken only by the rhythmic creaking of the ship and the pounding of his heart. He reached the sealed-off section and found the entrance, a heavy steel door, rusted and bolted shut. He used a crowbar he had found in a nearby storage room to pry the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound echoing through the deserted corridors. He stepped inside and was met by a wave of icy air, a palpable sense of dread. The corridor was dark and damp, the walls covered in a thick layer of grime. He could hear whispers again, faint and indistinct, but chilling nonetheless. He followed the corridor, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls, revealing glimpses of old equipment, rusting machinery, and forgotten tools. He reached a large, metal door at the end of the corridor. It was locked. He examined the door and found a small keypad next to it. He tried a few combinations, but the door remained locked. He knew he had to find the code. He searched the area and found a small office nearby. Inside, he discovered a desk with a stack of papers. He sifted through them and found a logbook with a series of numbers written on it. He tried the numbers on the keypad, and the door clicked open. He stepped into the room and found himself in a large, cavernous space. It was the sensory deprivation chamber. The room was filled with rows of metal chambers, each one just large enough to hold a human body. They were dark and silent, like tombs. Thomas felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He could almost feel the presence of the tormented souls who had been trapped inside these chambers, their screams and cries echoing through the empty space. He searched the room, looking for any evidence, any clue that could help him expose the truth. He found a file cabinet in a corner. Inside, he discovered more files, more reports, more details about the experiments. He also found a video recording. He put the recording into a nearby player and pressed play. The screen flickered to life, revealing a horrifying scene. It was Redacted, strapped to a chair inside one of the chambers. He was screaming, his eyes wide with terror. The video showed the doctors conducting the experiments, manipulating his senses, pushing him to the brink of madness. Thomas watched in horror as Redacted's mind was systematically broken down, his spirit crushed. He couldn't watch anymore. He turned off the recording, his hands trembling. He had seen enough. He had the proof he needed. He had to get out of there, to expose the truth, to bring justice to the victims. But as he turned to leave, he heard a sound behind him. A door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. It was the captain. "You shouldn't have come here," the captain said, his voice cold and menacing. "You know too much." The captain raised a hand, and two figures emerged from the shadows. They were crew members, but their eyes were blank, their faces devoid of emotion. They looked like puppets. Thomas knew he was trapped. The Hornet had claimed another victim. The captain's betrayal cut deeper than any blade. Thomas had naively believed that the truth, the sheer horror of the experiments, would be enough to sway even the most hardened heart. He was wrong. The Hornet's influence, its insidious grip on those who served within its steel walls, was stronger than he could have imagined. The captain, like so many others, had become a puppet of the ship, a guardian of its dark secrets. "You've seen what you shouldn't have," the captain said, his voice devoid of any warmth or humanity. "The Hornet doesn't tolerate those who pry into its past. It demands loyalty. It demands silence." The two crewmen moved towards Thomas, their movements stiff and unnatural. They were under the captain's control, their minds likely twisted and broken, just like the victims of the experiments. Thomas knew he couldn't fight them. He was outnumbered, trapped. He backed away, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. But there was none. The heavy steel door was his only way out, and the captain and his men stood in his way. "What are you going to do?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling slightly. The captain smiled, a chilling, predatory smile. "You're going to join them," he said, gesturing towards the metal chambers. "You're going to experience what they experienced. You're going to learn the true meaning of loyalty." Thomas's blood ran cold. He knew what the captain meant. He was going to be subjected to the same horrors as Redacted. His mind broken, his spirit crushed. He would become another ghost trapped within the walls of the Hornet, another voice whispering in the steel. He lunged forward, surprising the captain and his men. He wasn't trying to attack them. He was trying to reach the video recorder. He grabbed it and turned to face them, holding it up like a shield. "This recording," he shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. "It's going to be heard. The truth is going to come out. The Hornet's secrets will be revealed." The captain and his men hesitated. They knew the implications of the recording being released. It would expose the experiments, destroy the ship's reputation, and bring down those who were responsible. "Give me the recording," the captain said, his voice now laced with desperation. Thomas shook his head. "Not a chance," he said. "This is going to be my insurance policy." He backed away again, towards the door. He knew he had to escape, to get the recording off the ship, to expose the truth to the world. But as he reached the door, he felt a hand grab his arm. One of the crewmen had managed to get around him. He was pulled back into the room, the recording slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. The captain picked it up, a look of triumph on his face. "It's over," he said. Thomas knew he was defeated. He had failed. The Hornet had won. But as the captain turned to leave, a sound echoed through the chamber. A chilling whisper, a voice filled with pain and rage. "No." Redacted's ghost materialized in front of the captain, his spectral form flickering and shimmering. The captain stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror. You can't," he stammered. Redacted lunged forward, his spectral hand passing through the captain's body. The captain screamed, a sound that echoed through the chamber, filled with pure, unadulterated fear. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, Redacted vanished. The captain collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing. He was dead. The two crewmen stood frozen, their eyes wide with terror. They had witnessed something that they couldn't comprehend, something that defied all logic and reason. Thomas picked up the recording, his hands trembling. He knew he had to get out of there, to get off the ship, to share what he knew. He turned and fled, leaving the two crewmen cowering in the darkness. He ran through the corridors, the whispers chasing him, but they no longer held any fear for him. He had faced the Hornet's wrath, and he had survived. He reached the main deck and found Miller waiting for him. He showed him the recording, told him what had happened. Miller's face was pale, but he nodded. "I'll make sure this gets to the right people," he said. "The Hornet's secrets will be revealed." Thomas knew he had to leave the ship, to put as much distance between himself and the haunted vessel as possible. He couldn't stay there any longer. The Hornet had claimed too many lives, and he knew it would claim more if it wasn't stopped. As the ship pulled into port, Thomas disembarked, never looking back. He had escaped the Hornet's grasp, but he knew that the memories, the horrors he had witnessed, would stay with him forever. The USS Hornet continued its service, carrying its dark secrets, its whispers in the steel, waiting for its next victim. And somewhere, in the depths of the ship, the ghost of Redacted continued to wander, forever trapped, a chilling reminder of the horrors that lurked beneath the surface of the haunted Hornet. The County Road D horror. The Minnesota night was a black canvas speckled with the cold, distant glitter of stars. Brandon Swanson, a lanky 17-year-old, navigated the winding country roads after a party, his mind already replaying the awkward small talk he'd endured. He should have known better than to take County Road D. Everyone in town knew it was a shortcut to nowhere, especially after dark. But tonight, impatience outweighed caution. His old Pontiac sputtered and lurched, finally succumbing to the muddy shoulder of the road. "Great," Brandon muttered, the steam from his breath momentarily clouding the frosty air. He fished his cell phone from his pocket. One bar, enough to call his parents. "Hey, I'm stuck," he told his dad, Brian, his voice a mix of annoyance and teenage nonchalance. "County Road D. Yeah, I know. Just a little stuck. I can see a light though. I'll just walk towards it." Brian, ever practical, told him to stay put. He and his wife, Annette, would come find him. Brandon sighed. This was going to be a long night. As he waited, the silence of the countryside pressed in on him. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted. Just the whisper of the wind through the skeletal branches of the trees lining the road. The light he'd seen earlier had vanished, leaving him in near total darkness. He shivered, not just from the cold. There was something about the stillness, the utter lack of sound, that prickled the hairs on the back of his neck. He could hear his parents' car now, the distant hum growing louder. He told them he was heading south, towards the light he'd seen. "I'm walking towards a light," he repeated, his voice echoing slightly in the vast emptiness. Then, the silence returned, heavier this time. The car's hum faded. Brandon frowned. They must have missed the turn. He started walking again, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The darkness seemed to deepen, to coalesce into something tangible. He strained his eyes, trying to pierce the gloom. Suddenly, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision. He stopped, his heart pounding. Was it an animal? He couldn't make it out. It was just a shadow, a shifting darkness within the darkness. He held his breath, waiting. Nothing. He let out a shaky breath and continued walking, telling his parents he was still heading south. He could hear their voices now, faint but discernible, calling his name. "Brandon? Brandon! I'm here!" he shouted, his voice swallowed by the night. He could see their headlights now, two piercing beams cutting through the darkness. They were close. Then, the ground seemed to shift beneath his feet. He stumbled, catching himself just before he fell. He looked down. The road was gone. In its place was nothing, just an expanse of blackness that seemed to stretch into infinity. He recoiled, a wave of dizziness washing over him. He looked back towards the headlights. They were still there, but they seemed miles away, impossibly distant. He felt a surge of panic. "Mom? Dad?" he called out, his voice trembling. He heard a rustling sound behind him. He whirled around, his heart leaping into his throat. He saw it then, a figure emerging from the darkness. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the shadows. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding rather than walking. Brandon's blood ran cold. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was no ordinary person. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure raised a hand, and a single, long finger pointed directly at him. Brandon felt a jolt of pure terror, a primal fear that went beyond anything he had ever experienced. He tried to run, but his legs felt like lead. Then, he screamed. A high-pitched, piercing scream that echoed across the silent countryside. The phone slipped from his grasp and clattered to the ground. The line went dead. Brian and Annette Swanson felt a chill deeper than the autumn air when the phone went silent. The high-pitched scream that preceded the dead air echoed in their ears, a sound no parent ever wants to hear. Brian slammed his foot on the accelerator, the tires spitting gravel as he sped down County Road D. Annette gripped his arm, her knuckles white. "What was that, Brian? What was that scream?" Brian shook his head, his face grim. "I don't know, but we're going to find him." They drove for what felt like hours, their headlights cutting through the inky blackness. They called Brandon's name repeatedly, their voices hoarse with fear. But there was no answer, just the silence of the countryside, a silence that seemed to mock them. They reached the spot where Brandon's car was stuck. It was empty. The driver's side door hung open, the keys still in the ignition. Brandon's cell phone lay on the ground nearby. Brian picked it up, his hand trembling. No signal. They searched the immediate area, their flashlights' beams dancing across the frozen fields. They called out again and again, their voices growing more desperate with each passing minute. But there was no sign of Brandon. As the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky a bruised purple, they called the police. Sheriff Brody arrived with a team of deputies, their faces grim. They knew this stretch of road, knew its reputation. People had disappeared here before, vanished without a trace. A search party was organized, volunteers from the town joining the deputies. They fanned out across the fields, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. They searched ditches, culverts, abandoned farmhouses. They even brought in search dogs, their noses twitching as they sniffed the air. But the dogs found nothing. No scent trail, no sign of Brandon. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The sun rose, casting long shadows across the landscape. The search continued, but hope was dwindling. Brian and Annette watched, their faces etched with despair. They clung to each other, drawing strength from each other's presence. Sheriff Brody approached them, his expression sympathetic. "We'll keep looking," he said, his voice gentle. But he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They knew what he was thinking. As the day wore on, the search party grew smaller. Volunteers drifted away, their faces tired and discouraged. The deputies continued their work, but their movements were slow, their eyes heavy. Brian and Annette refused to give up. They stayed at the scene, their eyes scanning the horizon, searching for any sign of their son. They imagined him lost, injured, scared. They imagined him calling out for them, his voice lost in the vastness of the countryside. As darkness fell again, they returned home, their hearts heavy. They sat in the living room, the silence broken only by the occasional sob from Annette. They looked at pictures of Brandon, his smiling face a painful reminder of what they had lost. They went to bed, but sleep eluded them. They lay in the darkness, listening to the wind howling outside, a sound that seemed to echo Brandon's scream. In the days that followed, the search continued, but it was a formality. Everyone knew that Brandon was gone. The question was, where? And what had happened to him in those final, terrifying moments? The police investigated, but they found nothing. No witnesses, no clues, no leads. It was as if Brandon Swanson had never existed. The townspeople whispered about the disappearances on County Road D, their voices hushed. They spoke of strange lights, of eerie sounds, of a presence that seemed to watch from the shadows. They spoke of a darkness that swallowed people whole. Brian and Annette tried to move on, but the pain never went away. They carried it with them, a constant ache in their hearts. They visited the spot where Brandon's car had been found, hoping for some kind of closure. But there was nothing, just the empty road, the silent fields, the whispering wind. They never saw Brandon again. His disappearance remained a mystery, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the edge of the light. Years passed, and the disappearance of Brandon Swanson became a local legend, a chilling tale whispered around campfires and late-night gatherings. County Road D remained a place to avoid after dark, a stretch of asphalt where the veil between worlds seemed thin. Brian and Annette never gave up hope, not entirely. They clung to the sliver of possibility that Brandon was still out there, somewhere. But deep down, they knew the truth. They felt it in the coldness that settled in their bones, in the way the silence of the countryside echoed Brandon's final scream. One autumn night, Brian found himself drawn back to County Road D. He hadn't been there since the search, hadn't been able to bring himself to face the place where his son had vanished. But tonight, something compelled him. A feeling, a whisper in the back of his mind. He parked his truck at the edge of the road, the same spot where Brandon's car had been found. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the fields. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something indefinable. Brian got out of the truck and walked down the road, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He stopped at the spot where the ground had seemed to disappear, where Brandon had screamed. He shone his light into the blackness, but it revealed nothing, just the empty field, stretching out into the distance. He closed his eyes, trying to imagine what Brandon had seen, what he had felt in those final moments. He imagined the figure emerging from the darkness, the long finger pointing, the wave of terror. He heard the scream, echoing in his mind, a sound that would haunt him forever. He opened his eyes, and that's when he saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, just like Brandon had described. He strained his eyes, trying to make it out. It was a shadow, a shifting darkness within the darkness. It seemed to be moving towards him. Brian's heart pounded in his chest. He felt a surge of fear, a primal fear that he hadn't felt since that night so many years ago. He wanted to run, but his legs felt like lead. The figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the darkness. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding rather than walking. It raised a hand, and a long, skeletal finger pointed directly at Brian. Brian felt a jolt of pure terror, a fear that went beyond anything he had ever experienced. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was the same entity that had taken his son. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable. He waited for the scream, for the phone to go dead, but nothing happened. He opened his eyes. The figure was gone. Just the empty road, the silent fields, the whispering wind. Brian stood there for a long time, his body trembling. He didn't understand what he had seen, what he had felt, but he knew, deep down, that he had come face to face with the darkness that had claimed his son. He turned and walked back to his truck, his flashlight beam shaking in his hand. He got in and drove away, never looking back. He never returned to County Road D. He never spoke of what he had seen that night. He carried the secret with him, a burden that grew heavier with each passing year. Annette passed away a few years later, her heart broken by the loss of her son. Brian lived out the rest of his days in quiet solitude, haunted by the memories of Brandon, by the whispers in the dark. The disappearance of Brandon Swanson remains a mystery, a chilling reminder of the unknown that lurks just beyond the edge of our perception. Some say it was a tragic accident, a wrong turn in the dark. Others whisper of something more sinister, a presence that dwells in the shadows, waiting to claim its next victim. And on dark, moonless nights, when the wind whispers through the trees along County Road D, some say you can still hear the echo of a scream, a high-pitched, piercing scream that fades into the silence, leaving behind only the chilling certainty that something is out there, watching, waiting. The leapers of Overtown. The rain lashed against the windows of the cottage, mirroring the tempest brewing in Dr. Emily Watson's mind. She stared out at the tempestuous Scottish landscape, the dark silhouette of Overtown House looming on the horizon. The bridge, a graceful stone arch, was barely visible through the downpour, but Emily knew it was there, a silent sentinel guarding its secrets. Emily, a veterinary behaviorist, had come to Dumbartonshire to investigate the bizarre phenomenon of the dog suicides at Overtown Bridge. For years, dogs had inexplicably leaped from the bridge, plunging into the rocky gorge below. Some survived, only to return and repeat the fatal jump. Theories ranged from the scientific, scent trails of small animals luring the dogs over the edge, to the fantastical, a ghostly presence beckoning them to their doom. Emily, a woman of science, was determined to find a rational explanation, yet a nagging unease told her this was no ordinary behavioral anomaly. She had spent the day at the bridge, observing its structure, the surrounding terrain, and the behavior of dogs brought to the site by their owners. The bridge itself was unremarkable, a solid, elegant structure built in the 19th century. The drop, however, was significant, a sheer cliff face leading to a bed of jagged rocks. The wind howled through the gorge, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the faint, almost imperceptible, aroma of something else. Something Emily couldn't quite place. The local villagers spoke of Overtown House, the grand manor near the bridge, and its former owner, Lady Overtown. Legend had it that she was a recluse, deeply attached to her dogs, and that her spirit still roamed the grounds, heartbroken by their loss. Some whispered that she was the one calling the dogs to their deaths, seeking canine companions in the afterlife. Emily, a woman of logic, dismissed such tales as folklore, yet she couldn't deny the strange atmosphere that clung to the area, a palpable sense of sadness and unease. As the light faded, Emily decided to return to her cottage. The wind picked up, whipping the rain into a frenzy. She pulled her coat tighter around her, her breath misting in the cold air. As she drove past Overtown House, she glanced up at the imposing structure. It stood silhouetted against the stormy sky, its windows dark and empty, like the eyes of a blind giant. A shiver ran down her spine. She could have sworn she saw a flicker of movement in one of the upper windows, a fleeting glimpse of a figure watching her from the shadows. Back at the cottage, Emily tried to shake off the unsettling feeling. She reviewed her notes, analyzing the data she had collected. The scientific explanations seemed inadequate. The scent theory, while plausible, didn't explain why some dogs returned to jump again, or why the phenomenon was concentrated at this particular bridge. She felt a growing sense of frustration. She was a scientist, a woman of reason, yet she was confronted with something that defied logical explanation. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Emily jumped as a sudden gust of wind seemed to whisper her name. She dismissed it as her imagination, the product of a long and tiring day. But as she lay in bed, trying to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She closed her eyes, but the image of the dark windows of Overtown House and the fleeting figure she had seen kept flashing before her mind. Sleep evaded her. The whispers on the wind seemed to grow louder, carrying with them a sense of sorrow and despair. And then she heard it, a faint, mournful whine, like a dog in distress. It seemed to be coming from outside, carried on the wind. Emily sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She knew she had to investigate. Emily, driven by a mixture of scientific curiosity and a growing sense of unease, rose from her bed. The whining sound persisted, seemingly carried on the wind, a mournful cry that tugged at her heart. She grabbed her coat and a flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The rain had subsided to a drizzle, but the wind still howled, a constant, unsettling presence. She stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at her skin. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of Overtown Bridge. Hesitantly, she started to walk, the flashlight beam dancing across the wet pavement. The village was silent, shrouded in darkness, save for the occasional flickering street lamp. As she approached the bridge, the whining grew louder, more distinct. It was definitely the sound of a dog, but it was a sound filled with pain and despair. She reached the bridge, its stone arches looming like skeletal fingers against the night sky. The wind whipped around her, carrying the sound of the dog's cries. She swept the flashlight beam across the bridge, searching for the source of the sound. Suddenly, she saw it. A small, dark shape huddled near the edge of the bridge, its head bowed. It was a dog, a small terrier, its fur matted and wet. It was trembling, its body shaking uncontrollably. Emily approached cautiously, speaking softly to the animal. "It's all right," she murmured. "I'm here to help." The dog didn't move. It remained huddled on the edge of the bridge, its whimpers echoing in the night. As Emily got closer, she noticed something strange. The dog wasn't looking at her. Its gaze was fixed on something beyond the edge of the bridge, something Emily couldn't see. Its eyes were wide with terror, its body rigid with fear. Emily reached out to touch the dog, but it flinched away, letting out a low growl. Its teeth were bared, its eyes flashing. Emily recoiled, surprised by the dog's aggression. She had never encountered such fear and hostility in an animal before. She tried to speak to it again, but the dog only growled louder, its eyes still fixed on the unseen presence beyond the bridge. A cold shiver ran down Emily's spine. She felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that she was in the presence of something ancient and malevolent. The dog's terror was contagious, infecting her with its fear. She backed away slowly, her flashlight beam shaking in her hand. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew she had to get away from the bridge, away from the dog, away from whatever unseen presence was causing such terror. As she turned to leave, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a whisper, a faint, ethereal voice that seemed to be coming from the wind itself. It spoke her name, her full name, Emily Watson. The voice was cold and distant, yet it was filled with a chilling intimacy, as if it knew her, as if it had been waiting for her. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was alone on the bridge, yet she could feel the presence of someone, or something else. She turned slowly, scanning the darkness, her flashlight beam darting across the empty landscape. But there was nothing there, only the wind, the rain, and the sound of the dog's whimpers, and the whisper, her name echoing in the darkness, a chilling reminder that she was not alone. The whisper of her name, Emily Watson, hung in the air, a chilling caress that sent shivers down her spine. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to put as much distance as possible between herself and Overtown Bridge. Yet, a scientist's curiosity, a need to understand the inexplicable, rooted her to the spot. She gripped the flashlight tighter, the beam trembling slightly as she swept it across the desolate landscape. The dog remained huddled at the bridge's edge, its whimpers now laced with a low, guttural growl, its gaze fixed on something Emily couldn't see. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. Silence answered her, a silence more terrifying than any sound. The wind seemed to mock her question, whistling through the stone arches of the bridge like a mournful dirge. The dog shifted, its growl intensifying, and took a tentative step towards the edge. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Was it going to jump? Was it being compelled by some unseen force? She took a step closer to the dog, speaking softly, trying to reassure it. "It's all right," she murmured. "Come here. You'll be safe." But the dog ignored her, its eyes still fixed on the unseen presence beyond the bridge. It took another step, closer to the precipice. Emily felt a surge of panic. She couldn't let it jump. She lunged forward, grabbing at the dog's collar. As her fingers brushed against its fur, the dog snapped at her, its teeth bared in a ferocious snarl. Emily recoiled, narrowly avoiding its bite. The dog's eyes, now glowing with an eerie light, were no longer filled with fear. They were filled with malice, with a cold, predatory hunger. It was as if the dog had been transformed, possessed by something malevolent. Emily stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't understand what was happening. The dog's behavior was beyond anything she had ever encountered, beyond the realm of scientific explanation. She felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that she was facing something far more sinister than a simple behavioral anomaly. Suddenly, the wind picked up, swirling around her like a vortex. The dog on the bridge began to levitate, rising slowly into the air. Its growls turned into a high-pitched shriek, a sound that pierced the night. Emily watched in horror as the dog floated above the bridge, its body contorting, its fur standing on end. The light in its eyes intensified, burning like twin embers. And then, she saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows beneath the bridge, a dark, amorphous shape that seemed to coalesce from the swirling wind. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the darkness. But Emily could feel its presence, a cold, malevolent energy that radiated from it like a palpable force. It was reaching out towards the dog, its shadowy hand outstretched. Emily screamed, a sound that was swallowed by the wind. She turned and ran, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the ground. She didn't look back. She didn't want to see what was happening behind her. She just wanted to get away, to escape the bridge, the dog, the figure in the shadows. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the dog's shrieks behind her, growing fainter as she fled. She didn't stop running until she reached her cottage, slamming the door behind her and locking it. She leaned against the door, gasping for breath, her body trembling. She couldn't explain what she had seen. The dog levitating, the figure in the shadows. It defied all logic, all reason. But she knew one thing. She had witnessed something truly terrifying, something that would forever haunt her dreams. She knew she couldn't stay here. She had to leave, to get away from Overtown Bridge, away from the evil that lurked in its shadows. But even as she made her decision to flee, a chilling thought crept into her mind. What if it was too late? What if the evil had already found her? What if it was already inside her head, waiting to be unleashed? As she stared into the darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the figure in the shadows was still there, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision, waiting for her. The cottage, meant to be a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of the wind against the windows, sounded like the approach of something unseen, something malevolent. Emily huddled on the sofa, the flashlight beam shaking in her hand as she scanned the room. Shadows danced in the corners, morphing into grotesque shapes that played tricks on her eyes. She knew she couldn't stay here. She had to leave, to escape the terror that had taken root in her mind. But where could she go? The nearest town was miles away, and the storm, though lessened, still raged. Driving in this weather would be treacherous. Yet, staying here felt like a death sentence. She imagined the figure from the bridge, its shadowy hand reaching out, its cold presence filling the room. She could almost hear the dog's shriek, echoing in her ears. Driven by fear, Emily decided to take her chances with the storm. She grabbed her bag, stuffing it with essentials, her laptop, her research notes, a change of clothes. She hesitated, then added a small, silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother. It was a tangible connection to her past, a symbol of hope in the face of overwhelming fear. As she opened the door, a gust of wind nearly ripped it from her grasp. The rain had picked up again, lashing against the windows like angry fists. The darkness was thick and impenetrable, the only light coming from her flashlight beam. She stepped out into the storm, the wind howling around her like a chorus of tormented souls. The drive was a nightmare. The rain blurred her vision, the wind buffeted her car, and the darkness seemed to press in on her from all sides. Every shadow looked like the figure from the bridge, every sound like the dog's shriek. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, her heart pounding in her chest. As she drove, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. She glanced in her rearview mirror, but saw nothing but the swirling rain and the dark road behind her. Yet, the feeling persisted, a chilling certainty that something was out there, something unseen, something malevolent. Suddenly, her car lurched violently, throwing her forward against the steering wheel. She slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the wet road. She looked in the rearview mirror and saw it, a dark shape in the road behind her, a large, shadowy figure that seemed to be moving towards her. Her blood ran cold. It was the figure from the bridge. It had followed her. She threw the car into reverse, desperate to escape. But the figure was too fast. It was gaining on her, its shadowy form growing larger in her mirror. She slammed on the brakes again, the car skidding to a halt. The figure was right behind her now, its dark presence filling her vision. She could feel its cold breath on the back of her neck. She turned to face it, her flashlight beam shaking in her hand. The figure was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the darkness. But Emily could see its eyes, two glowing red points that burned like embers in the night. They were filled with malice, with a cold, predatory hunger. They were the eyes of something not human. The figure reached out towards her, its shadowy hand outstretched. Emily screamed, a sound that was swallowed by the storm. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. But the touch never came. Instead, she heard a sound, a faint whisper that seemed to echo in her mind. It spoke her name again, her full name, Emily Watson. The voice was cold and distant, yet it was filled with a chilling intimacy, as if it knew her, as if it had been waiting for her. And then, everything went black. Emily awoke to a world of muted colors and a pervasive, chilling stillness. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie calm. She lay on a soft surface, her body aching, her head throbbing. Disoriented, she slowly sat up, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She was in a room she didn't recognize. The walls were paneled in dark wood, the furniture antique and ornate. A single window, draped with heavy velvet curtains, offered a glimpse of a gray, overcast sky. Where was she? The last thing she remembered was the figure in the road, its glowing red eyes burning into her soul. Had she been in an accident? But this room, it felt old, almost oppressive. There was a strange, musty scent in the air, like dried flowers and something else, something she couldn't quite place. She stood up, her legs unsteady. She felt weak, drained, as if a part of her had been taken away. She looked around the room, searching for a clue, something that would tell her where she was. A small writing desk stood against one wall, a stack of papers lying on its surface. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The papers were handwritten, in a flowing, elegant script. They were dated from the late 19th century, detailing the history of Overtown House and its inhabitants. As she read, a chill crept over her. The papers spoke of Lady Overtown, her love for her dogs, and her deep sorrow at their deaths. They also mentioned a series of strange occurrences on the estate, whispers of ghostly apparitions and unexplained phenomena. One passage, in particular, caught her attention. It described a ritual performed by Lady Overtown, a desperate attempt to communicate with her deceased pets. The ritual involved a dark, ancient artifact, a relic said to possess a malevolent energy. The papers claimed that the ritual had gone wrong. unleashing a terrible force that haunted the grounds of Overtown House. Emily's breath hitched. The figure on the bridge, the dog's transformation, the whispers in the wind. It all started to make sense. She wasn't just dealing with a behavioral anomaly. She was facing something supernatural, something ancient and evil. A sudden noise startled her. She turned to see the door slowly creaking open. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. It was the figure from the bridge. But as the figure stepped into the room, Emily realized it wasn't the shadowy figure she had seen before. This figure was human, a woman dressed in a long, flowing gown. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow. It was Lady Overtown. Lady Overtown glided towards her, her movements ethereal, almost spectral. She didn't speak, but her eyes conveyed a deep sadness, a profound sense of loss. She reached out towards Emily, her hand trembling. Emily instinctively recoiled, fear gripping her. But as Lady Overtown's hand drew closer, Emily saw something else in her eyes, a plea, a desperate cry for help. Lady Overtown wasn't a malevolent spirit. She was a prisoner, trapped by the evil she had unleashed. Emily hesitated, then slowly extended her hand. As their fingers touched, a surge of energy passed between them. Emily felt a jolt, a shock that resonated through her entire being. Suddenly, images flooded her mind. Visions of the past, of Lady Overtown's life, her love for her dogs, her despair at their deaths, and the fateful ritual that had sealed her fate. Emily understood now. Lady Overtown wasn't the one who had called the dogs to their deaths. She was trying to stop it, trying to contain the evil that she had inadvertently unleashed. She needed Emily's help. The flood of images subsided, leaving Emily reeling. She understood now. Lady Overtown wasn't the malevolent force, but a victim, trapped within the web of her own making. The ritual, born of grief, had opened a doorway to something ancient and malevolent, something that now used Overtown Bridge as its hunting ground. And Lady Overtown, bound to the house, was powerless to stop it. She needed Emily, a living conduit, to break the cycle. Lady Overtown's spectral form flickered, her gaze intense. She gestured towards the window, then to a small, ornate box on the writing desk. Emily understood. The artifact, the source of the evil, was still here. It had to be destroyed. Emily, her fear replaced by a surge of determination, approached the desk. The box was made of dark wood, intricately carved with symbols she didn't recognize. It felt cold to the touch, radiating a palpable sense of unease. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a small, obsidian stone. It was smooth, polished, and seemed to pulse with a faint, inner light. This was it, the artifact, the key to the horror that plagued Overtown Bridge. She picked it up, the coldness seeping into her fingers. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she saw another vision. The ritual, Lady Overtown placing the stone on a pedestal, chanting in a long-forgotten language. Then, a surge of dark energy, the room growing cold, the dog's whimpers turning into shrieks. The vision ended, leaving Emily shaken but resolute. She knew what she had to do. She turned back to Lady Overtown, who nodded, her eyes filled with a desperate hope. Emily understood. The stone had to be returned to where it came from, the source of the evil sealed once more. But where was that? Lady Overtown pointed again to the window, then to the papers on the desk. Emily picked them up, scanning the pages. One passage stood out, a description of an ancient burial ground, located on the far side of the Overtown estate, a place where pagan rituals were once performed. This was it, the source, the place where the stone belonged. She clutched the obsidian artifact tightly, feeling its malevolent energy trying to influence her, whispering promises of power. But Emily resisted, focusing on Lady Overtown's pleading eyes, the image of the terrified dogs on the bridge. She wouldn't let this evil win. She nodded to Lady Overtown, a silent promise passing between them. She turned and left the room, determined to finish what she had started. She had to return the stone, to seal the doorway, to free Lady Overtown and the tormented souls trapped by the evil she had unleashed. The house was silent, the air thick with a sense of dread. As Emily made her way through the labyrinthine corridors, she felt eyes watching her from the shadows. She could hear whispers, faint echoes of the ritual chant, the dog's shrieks. The house was alive, a vessel of dark energy, trying to prevent her from reaching her goal. She finally found the main entrance, a massive oak door that seemed to weigh a ton. As she pushed it open, a gust of wind swept through the house, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the faint, almost imperceptible, aroma of something else. The same scent she had smelled at the bridge, the scent of evil. The path to the ancient burial ground was overgrown, the stones moss-covered and crumbling. The wind howled around her, whipping through the trees, their branches clawing at her like skeletal fingers. The darkness was almost complete, the only light coming from the moon, which peeked through the clouds like a watchful eye. As she reached the burial ground, she saw it, a circle of standing stones, their surfaces covered with strange symbols. In the center of the circle was a flat stone, an altar of some kind. This was the place. She approached the altar, the obsidian stone growing heavier in her hand. She placed it on the flat stone, and as she did, the ground began to tremble. The wind intensified, swirling around her like a vortex. The standing stones seemed to glow with an eerie light. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the darkness. It was the figure from the bridge, the embodiment of the evil that haunted Overtown. It reached out towards her, its shadowy hand outstretched. Emily closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. But this time, she wouldn't run. She had come too far. She had to face it, to destroy it, once and for all. The figure loomed closer, its icy presence chilling Emily to the bone. But instead of fear, a surge of defiance coursed through her. She wouldn't cower. She wouldn't run. She had come to banish this evil, and she would see it through. As the shadowy hand reached for her, Emily focused on the obsidian stone, now pulsing with an intense light. She remembered Lady Overtown's desperate plea, the terrified eyes of the dogs. She channeled that energy, that raw emotion, into her voice. "You will not have this place," she cried, her voice ringing out against the wind. "You will not have these souls." The figure recoiled, its shadowy form flickering. The ground trembled more violently, the standing stones glowing brighter. The wind shrieked, a chorus of tormented souls. But Emily stood firm, her gaze locked on the obsidian stone. She raised her hands towards the stone, feeling a strange energy flowing through her. It was the power of the earth, the power of life, the power of hope. She focused that energy, directing it towards the stone, towards the figure, towards the evil that had plagued Overtown for so long. "Go back," she commanded, her voice filled with a newfound strength. "Return to the darkness from whence you came." The obsidian stone erupted in a blinding flash of light. The figure screamed, a sound that tore through the night, a sound of pure agony. Its shadowy form began to dissipate, dissolving into the wind like smoke. The standing stones dimmed, the ground stopped trembling. The wind subsided, leaving behind an eerie silence. Emily stood there, panting, her body shaking. The obsidian stone was now dull, its light extinguished. The figure was gone. The evil had been banished. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, carrying with it a whisper, soft as a sigh. Emily turned and saw Lady Overtown standing nearby, her spectral form now radiant, her eyes filled with gratitude. She smiled at Emily, a smile of peace, a smile of freedom. Then she began to fade, dissolving into the moonlight, finally at rest. Emily watched her go, a sense of closure washing over her. The nightmare was over. The evil had been defeated. Overtown Bridge was safe. She turned and walked away from the ancient burial ground, the first rays of dawn painting the sky with hues of hope. The wind whispered around her, no longer a chorus of tormented souls, but a gentle caress, a whisper of thanks. As she left the Overtown estate, she glanced back at the house, its dark windows now reflecting the morning light. It no longer looked menacing, but simply old, a relic of a bygone era. The terror was gone, replaced by a sense of peace, a sense of resolution. Emily knew she would never forget what she had experienced. She had faced the darkness, and she had emerged victorious. She had helped a trapped spirit find peace, and she had freed a place from the grip of evil. She had faced her fears, and in doing so, she had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. The mystery of Overtown Bridge might never be fully solved, but Emily knew the truth. She knew the evil that lurked there, and she knew the courage it took to banish it. And as she drove away, she carried with her the knowledge that even in the darkest of places, hope can prevail and light can conquer darkness. The Obsidian Gaze. The old brick house stood on a quiet cul-de-sac in Mill Creek, Ohio, its paint peeled like sunburnt skin, and the overgrown yard whispered secrets to the wind. Sarah, a freelance journalist with a penchant for the strange, had inherited the house from her estranged grandmother, a woman she barely knew. Sarah wasn't superstitious, not really. She preferred logic, facts, the tangible world. But the house had a feeling, a weight in the air, a chill that clung to the bones even on a sweltering summer day. Sarah had moved in a week ago, intending to renovate and flip the property. She'd started with the attic, a dusty, cavernous space filled with forgotten belongings. Amongst the antique furniture and moth-eaten clothes, she found a box, a wooden box, intricately carved with symbols she didn't recognize. Inside, a collection of newspaper clippings, all detailing strange occurrences in the area. Disappearances, unexplained fires, and whispers of children. One clipping, dated from the late 1970s, caught her eye. It spoke of children with eyes like black pools, seen begging for help on lonely roads. The article dismissed them as runaways, victims of some social ill. But the handwritten note scrawled in the margin gave Sarah pause. "They're not what they seem. Beware their knock." Sarah scoffed. Grandmother had been a bit of an eccentric, according to the few relatives she'd spoken to. Still, the story niggled at her. She'd done some research online and discovered the legend of the black-eyed children. A modern myth, some called it, an urban legend passed around on late-night forums. But the descriptions, they were disturbingly consistent. Children, usually between the ages of 6 and 16, with completely black eyes, no irises, no pupils. They appear at doorsteps, on roadsides, always at night. They ask for help, for a ride, to be let inside. And a feeling of dread, an almost paralyzing fear, grips those who encounter them. Sarah, ever the journalist, felt a flicker of curiosity. She told herself it was just research, a potential article. But deep down, a primal unease stirred within her. She spent the next few days delving deeper into the phenomenon. She found countless stories online, shared by people from all over the world. Some were clearly fabricated, but others had a ring of truth to them. They spoke of an unnatural politeness, a chilling calmness in the children's demeanor, and the eyes, always the eyes. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the yard, Sarah sat on her porch, a stack of printouts about the black-eyed children scattered around her. The air was still, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. A sudden gust of wind rustled the leaves of the old oak tree in her yard, making them sound like whispers. Sarah shivered, pulling her cardigan tighter around her. She told herself it was just the chill of the evening, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A soft tap on the front door made her jump. Her heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't been expecting anyone. Cautiously, she rose and walked towards the door. Another tap. She peered through the peephole. Two children stood on her porch. A boy and a girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old. They wore simple, clean clothes. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as Sarah's eyes drifted up to meet theirs, her blood ran cold. Their eyes, they were completely black. Sarah froze, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The children stood motionless, their expressions unreadable in the dim porch light. The boy, slightly taller than the girl, had his hands clasped in front of him, a gesture that seemed both polite and strangely formal. The girl simply stared, her head tilted slightly as if listening for something Sarah couldn't hear. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the frantic beating of Sarah's heart. "Can I help you?" she managed, her voice a little shaky. The boy finally spoke, his voice surprisingly deep for a child. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. "Our car broke down. Our mom is just down the road. Could we use your phone?" Sarah hesitated. It was a plausible story. Mill Creek was a quiet town, but breakdowns happened. Yet, something about the children, their unnatural stillness, the way their black eyes seemed to absorb the light, sent shivers down her spine. She couldn't shake the image of the newspaper clipping, the warning about their knock. I don't have a landline," she stammered, "and my cell phone reception is terrible here. I could try to call someone for you from inside, but I'd have to keep the door closed." The boy's expression didn't change. "We just need to use your phone," he repeated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. The girl remained silent, her gaze fixed on Sarah. A wave of unease washed over Sarah. She knew she was being irrational, that she was letting fear cloud her judgment. But the feeling in the pit of her stomach, the primal instinct screaming at her to stay away, was overwhelming. "I'm really sorry," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "but I can't. It's not safe to open the door at night. You understand, right?" The boy and girl exchanged a look that seemed to pass between them in the blink of an eye. Then, the boy turned back to Sarah, his black eyes boring into hers. "Please," he said, his voice now laced with a strange urgency. "We just need to come in. It won't take long." The girl took a step closer, her hand reaching out as if to touch the screen door. Sarah recoiled, a gasp escaping her lips. She stumbled backward, bumping into a small table in the hallway. A framed photo of her grandmother, taken when she was a young woman, fell to the floor, the glass shattering. The boy and girl didn't react to the noise. They simply continued to stare at Sarah, their black eyes gleaming in the dim light. Sarah felt a wave of dizziness, a strange pressure building in her head. She felt like she was losing control, like her will was being slowly drained away. She knew she had to do something, anything. She fumbled for the deadbolt lock on the door, her fingers shaking. She managed to slide it into place with a loud click. She then backed away from the door, her eyes never leaving the children. "Go away," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just go away." The boy and girl remained on the porch for a moment longer, their black eyes fixed on Sarah. Then, slowly, silently, they turned and walked away. Sarah watched them go, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't breathe a sigh of relief until they were completely out of sight, swallowed by the darkness of the night. She leaned against the door, her body trembling. She felt drained, exhausted, as if she had just fought off some unseen force. She knew she had to call the police, tell them what had happened, but a part of her, a deep, unsettling part, knew that they wouldn't be able to do anything. She had a feeling that what she had just encountered was beyond their understanding, beyond the realm of the ordinary. She glanced down at the broken photo of her grandmother. A chill ran down her spine. She picked up the photo and looked at her grandmother's face. There was something in her eyes, a hint of sadness, a knowing look that Sarah had never noticed before. She suddenly remembered the note in the margin of the newspaper clipping, "They're not what they seem. Beware their knock." Sarah realized that she was in danger. She didn't know what the black-eyed children were, or what they wanted, but she knew that they were not human. And she knew that they would be back. The night passed slowly, each creak of the old house sounding like the return of the black-eyed children. Sarah barely slept, her mind racing with questions and fears. Dawn finally broke, painting the sky in hues of gray and pink, a weak promise of warmth. Sarah, bleary-eyed and exhausted, decided she needed answers. She started with her grandmother's belongings. The wooden box in the attic held more than just newspaper clippings. There were journals filled with her grandmother's spidery handwriting, detailing strange occurrences and local legends. One entry, dated just a few weeks before her grandmother's death, mentioned the black-eyed children specifically. It spoke of a ritual, a way to ward them off, involving specific herbs and symbols. Sarah, a woman of science, felt a wave of skepticism, but the fear she felt was stronger than her doubt. She decided to consult with a local historian, a man named Mr. Abernathy, who ran the small historical society museum in town. He was a quiet, bookish man with a vast knowledge of Mill Creek's past. Sarah showed him the newspaper clippings and the journal entries. Mr. Abernathy's eyes widened as he read them. He recognized the symbols in the journal, ancient protective sigils used by early settlers in the area. "The black-eyed children," he murmured, his voice hushed. "Legends, we call them. But there are stories, old stories, whispered in the dark." He told Sarah about the history of Mill Creek, how it was built on land that was once considered sacred by the Native American tribes. He spoke of ancient spirits, of rituals gone wrong, and of children lost in the woods, their souls forever trapped between worlds. He didn't dismiss the black-eyed children as mere folklore. He spoke of them with a strange reverence, a hint of fear in his eyes. Mr. Abernathy explained that the black-eyed children were said to be drawn to places of strong energy, places where the veil between worlds was thin. He warned Sarah that her house, with its history and the strange box in the attic, might be one such place. He advised her to be careful, to avoid contact with them at all costs. Sarah left the museum feeling more confused and frightened than ever. She wanted to dismiss it all as superstition, but the encounter at her doorstep, the chilling presence of those children, made it impossible to ignore. She returned home, determined to find out more about her grandmother's research. She spent the next few days poring over the journals, trying to decipher the cryptic language and the strange symbols. She learned that her grandmother had been studying the occult, that she had been trying to understand the forces beyond the veil of the visible world. Sarah discovered that her grandmother believed the black-eyed children were not simply malevolent spirits, but something else, something ancient, something powerful, something that fed on fear. One evening, as Sarah was reading in the attic, she found another box. This one was smaller, made of dark wood and locked. She found the key hidden inside a hollowed-out book. Inside the box, she found a single object, a small, intricately carved wooden doll. It was old, the wood worn smooth with age. As Sarah picked it up, she felt a strange, tingling sensation, a jolt of energy that made her drop the doll as if it had burned her. She picked it up again, more cautiously this time. She noticed that the doll's eyes were made of black obsidian, mirroring the terrifying gaze of the black-eyed children. A wave of nausea washed over her. She felt a presence in the room, a cold, heavy feeling that made her breath catch in her throat. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was no longer alone. A soft whisper echoed through the attic, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah strained to hear, her heart pounding in her chest. "Let us in," the whisper said, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "We're cold." Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew they were back. Sarah's breath hitched. The whisper, thin and reedy, seemed to crawl into her ear, planting a seed of icy dread. She clutched the wooden doll, its obsidian eyes staring back at her, mirroring the terror in her own. The attic air grew heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She knew she had to act, to do something. Her grandmother's journal, with its cryptic instructions, flashed through her mind. She scrambled through the scattered papers, her fingers trembling as she searched for the specific passage. It spoke of a protective ritual, an ancient rite to ward off malevolent entities. It required specific herbs, symbols, and a focused will. Sarah, a woman of logic and reason, found herself clinging to this sliver of hope, this desperate attempt to fight back against the unseen terror that stalked her. The journal described the herbs mugwort, vervain, and rosemary, all said to possess protective properties. Sarah knew she had some dried herbs in the kitchen, remnants of a long-abandoned attempt at gardening. She raced downstairs, her footsteps echoing through the silent house. She found the herbs, their pungent scent filling the air as she gathered them. Back in the attic, she laid out the herbs on a small table, following the instructions in the journal. She found a piece of charcoal in a dusty box and, with trembling hands, began to draw the symbols on the floor, circles within circles, interlaced with strange, angular lines. The symbols felt alien, yet somehow familiar, as if they were etched into her subconscious. As she worked, the whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a chilling wind. "Let us in," they hissed, their voices laced with impatience. "We're hungry." Sarah tried to block out the voices, focusing on the ritual, on the precise movements of her hands. She lit a small candle, its flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the attic walls. She placed the wooden doll in the center of the circle, its obsidian eyes seeming to follow her every move. The journal spoke of a chant, a series of words in a language she didn't recognize. She tried to pronounce them, her voice wavering at first, then growing stronger as she repeated the strange syllables. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. She felt a presence, a dark, malevolent force pressing against her, trying to break through her defenses. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from downstairs. Sarah jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. The whispers intensified, becoming a chorus of voices, all demanding to be let in. She knew they were trying to distract her, to break her concentration. She had to stay focused, to complete the ritual. She continued the chant, her voice rising in a crescendo. The candle flame flickered wildly, threatening to extinguish. The wooden doll seemed to vibrate, a low hum emanating from its obsidian eyes. Sarah felt a surge of power, a strange energy flowing through her. She knew she was close, that the ritual was almost complete. Another bang, this time from the front door. She could hear the doorknob rattling, the wood splintering under the force of their attempts to break in. The whispers turned into screams, filled with rage and frustration. "Let us in! Let us in!" they shrieked. Sarah finished the chant, her voice hoarse. She raised her hands, palms facing outwards, towards the door. She felt a surge of energy, a powerful force emanating from her, pushing back against the darkness. The banging stopped. The screams faded into whispers, then silence. The attic air grew still, the tension slowly dissipating. Sarah stood there, panting, her body trembling. She didn't know if she had succeeded, if she had truly warded them off. But for now, at least they were gone. She looked down at the wooden doll, its obsidian eyes now dull and lifeless. She picked it up and wrapped it in a piece of cloth, then placed it back in the box. She knew she had to get rid of it, to remove it from her house. She also knew that this was just the beginning. The black-eyed children were not easily deterred. They would be back, and she had a feeling that the next time, they would be stronger. The following days were filled with a tense quiet. Sarah felt like she was living in a bubble, waiting for it to burst. She researched everything she could find about the black-eyed children, delving into folklore, mythology, and even obscure occult texts. She learned that they were often associated with liminal spaces, doorways, thresholds, places between one world and another. They were said to be drawn to fear, to feed on the negative energy it generated. She also learned that they were not always content with simply being let in. Sometimes they sought something more, a connection, a vessel. A chilling thought crossed her mind. Were they trying to possess her? The house felt different now. The oppressive weight had lifted, but it was replaced by a subtle unease, a feeling of being watched. Sarah found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, jumping at every creak and shadow. She knew she couldn't stay here any longer. The house, with its dark history and its connection to the black-eyed children, was too dangerous. She decided to sell the house. She contacted a real estate agent, a bubbly woman named Carol, who seemed unfazed by the house's slightly dilapidated state. Sarah didn't tell her about the strange occurrences, about the chilling encounter at her doorstep. She simply said she was moving on, that she needed a fresh start. Carol found a buyer quickly, a young couple eager to renovate the old house and turn it into their dream home. Sarah felt a pang of guilt as she signed the papers, handing over the keys to the unsuspecting couple. She wanted to warn them, to tell them about the black-eyed children, but she knew they wouldn't believe her. They would think she was crazy. She packed her belongings, leaving behind everything that reminded her of the house, of the terror she had experienced. She moved to a small apartment in the city, a clean, modern space that felt safe and anonymous. She tried to put the past behind her, to forget about the black-eyed children, but they didn't forget about her. A few weeks later, Sarah received a phone call. It was Carol, the real estate agent. Her voice was trembling, barely audible. She told Sarah that the young couple who had bought the house had disappeared, vanished without a trace. The police had found their car abandoned a few miles outside of town. There was no sign of them. Carol's voice broke. "Sarah," she whispered, "there's something else, something strange." She told Sarah that the neighbors had reported seeing children with black eyes, standing outside the house at night. They hadn't said anything, hadn't asked to be let in. They had simply stood there, staring at the house. Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew what it meant. The black-eyed children had found their way back to the house, and they were waiting. She hung up the phone, her hands shaking. She knew she couldn't run away from them. She had to face them, to confront the darkness that had invaded her life. She didn't know how, but she knew she had to find a way to stop them, to protect others from their chilling presence. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew it would be dangerous, but she also knew that she had no choice. The black-eyed children were out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next victim. And Sarah, armed with the knowledge she had gained, was determined to stop them, even if it meant risking her own life. The shadow of the rectory. The autumn of 1929 draped the English countryside in a melancholic beauty, a tapestry of russet and gold. Reverend Henry Dawson and his wife, Mary Ann, arrived at Borley Rectory with a mix of trepidation and quiet excitement. The rectory, a large, somewhat dilapidated Victorian structure, stood on a slight rise overlooking the small village of Borley in Essex. It had a reputation, a whisper that slithered through the community like a draft under a door. It was said to be haunted. The Dawsons, however, were practical people. Henry, a man of God, believed in the power of faith to dispel any darkness. Mary Ann, a former nurse, was grounded in the tangible world. They dismissed the local gossip as superstition, remnants of a time when shadows held more sway over the imagination. The rectory, despite its slightly unsettling atmosphere, was their new home, and they were determined to make the best of it. The house itself seemed to sigh as they entered. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight filtering through the grimy windows, illuminating the peeling wallpaper and the worn floorboards. An air of neglect hung heavy, as if the house had been waiting, dormant, for its new occupants. The Dawsons set about their task, unpacking their belongings and attempting to infuse the cold, empty rooms with a sense of warmth and life. It wasn't long, however, before the whispers began to manifest in more tangible ways. At first, they were subtle, a floorboard creaking when no one was moving, a door gently swinging open when there was no breeze. Mary Ann, with her nurse's training, attributed these to the age of the house, the settling of the foundations, the quirks of an old building. Henry, too, found logical explanations for the strange occurrences. But as the days turned into weeks, the incidents became more frequent, more pronounced, and harder to dismiss. One evening, as the Dawsons sat by the fire in the drawing room, a series of sharp, distinct knocks echoed from the hallway. Henry, ever the rationalist, went to investigate, but found nothing amiss. All the doors were securely closed, and the house was silent save for the crackling of the fire. He returned to the drawing room, a slight frown creasing his brow. Marianne, though she tried to appear calm, felt a prickle of unease. The knocking continued intermittently, sometimes during the day, sometimes at night. It was never loud, never aggressive, but always present. A constant, subtle reminder that they were not alone in the house. Then came the whispers, not audible words, but a low, murmuring sound, like voices just beyond the threshold of hearing. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a constant, unsettling background hum to their lives. One particularly cold November night, the Dawsons were awakened by a blood-curdling scream. It was Marianne. Henry rushed to her side, finding her sitting bolt upright in bed, her eyes wide with terror. "I saw her," she gasped, her voice trembling. "A woman, in the hallway. She was just standing there, staring at me." Henry, though shaken, tried to comfort his wife, suggesting it was a bad dream. But Marianne insisted she had been awake. She described the figure in detail. A woman in a dark dress, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. Henry, despite his skepticism, couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. The whispers in the walls had become a chilling reality, and the Dawsons' comfortable, rational world was beginning to crumble. The apparition of the woman in the hallway marked a turning point for the Dawsons. Sleep became a fitful, uneasy affair, punctuated by Marianne's nightmares and Henry's increasingly troubled thoughts. The knocking persisted, the whispers intensified, and a new phenomenon emerged. Objects moving on their own. A book would fall from a shelf, a chair would scrape across the floor, a cold gust of wind would sweep through a room despite all the windows being closed. Marianne, her nerves frayed, began to research the history of Borley Rectory. She discovered a dark and disturbing past. The rectory had been built on the site of an old monastery, and local legend spoke of a tragic love affair between a monk and a nun. Their forbidden romance had ended in tragedy, with the nun being walled up alive within the monastery walls. Marianne found accounts of other residents of the rectory reporting similar experiences. Ghostly figures, unexplained noises, and a pervasive sense of unease. One particular story caught her attention. The tale of a former resident who had claimed to see the ghostly figure of a nun walking the grounds, her face pale and sorrowful. The description matched the figure Marianne had seen in the hallway. A chill ran down her spine. Could the stories be true? Was the rectory truly haunted by the spirits of the past? Henry, though still clinging to his rational explanations, found himself increasingly disturbed by the events. He began to keep a journal, documenting each strange occurrence, hoping to find a pattern, a logical explanation. But the more he recorded, the more convinced he became that something inexplicable was happening. He consulted with other clergymen, but none could offer a satisfactory explanation. One afternoon, while Henry was away visiting a neighboring parish, Marianne was alone in the rectory. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Suddenly, she heard a noise from the attic, a scratching sound, like something dragging across the floor. Her heart pounding, Marianne cautiously made her way up the creaking stairs. The attic was dark and dusty, filled with forgotten belongings and cobwebs that clung like ghostly shrouds. The scratching sound continued, coming from a corner of the room. Marianne, her hand trembling, held up a candle, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. As she approached the corner, she saw it, a small, wooden doll lying on its side. Its painted eyes seemed to stare up at her, accusing. Marianne picked up the doll, her fingers brushing against its cold, smooth surface. As she did so, she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. The room seemed to spin, and the scratching sound intensified, morphing into a high-pitched whisper that seemed to echo inside her head. She stumbled back, dropping the doll as if it had burned her. The doll lay on the floor, its eyes still fixed on her. Marianne fled the attic, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She ran to the village, seeking refuge in the local pub. She told the villagers about the doll, about the scratching sound, about the whispers. The villagers listened with a mixture of fear and fascination. They knew the stories of the rectory, and they knew that Marianne was not the first to experience its dark secrets. One old woman, her face etched with wrinkles and wisdom, spoke up. "The doll," she said, her voice low and grave. "It is said that the spirits of the rectory are drawn to objects of innocence, things that represent life and joy. The doll, it may be a conduit for their power." Marianne's blood ran cold. She knew she had to return to the rectory. She had to confront the darkness that lurked within its walls. But she also knew that she couldn't do it alone. She needed help, someone who understood the supernatural, someone who could help her unravel the mysteries of Borley Rectory. Marianne, desperate for answers, sought the counsel of Reverend Lionel Foister, a vicar from a neighboring town known for his interest in the paranormal. Foister, a tall, gaunt man with piercing blue eyes, listened intently to Marianne's account of the strange happenings at Borley Rectory. He had heard the whispers surrounding the house, the tales of ghostly apparitions and unexplained phenomena. He agreed to visit the rectory, to investigate the claims, and to offer whatever assistance he could. The following day, Foister arrived at Borley Rectory. The house seemed to exude an aura of coldness, a palpable sense of unease that settled upon him as he crossed the threshold. He and Marianne walked through the silent rooms, the air thick with an unseen presence. Foister, a seasoned investigator of the supernatural, felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the distinct feeling of being watched. They explored the attic, where Marianne had encountered the doll. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and decay, and a strange stillness hung over the room. Foister examined the spot where Marianne had found the doll. He noticed a small, almost imperceptible mark on the floor, as if something had been dragged across it. He knelt down, examining the mark closely. It seemed to be a scratch, but it was too deliberate, too precise, to have been made by an animal. Foister turned his attention to the doll. Marianne had placed it on a table in the attic. It sat there, its painted eyes staring blankly ahead. Foister picked it up, feeling the same wave of dizziness that Marianne had described. He quickly set it down, a sense of unease creeping over him. There was something about the doll, something inherently disturbing, that resonated with the darkness of the house. As they continued their exploration, Foister noticed other strange details. Symbols scratched into the walls, cryptic messages scrawled on scraps of paper, and a series of cold spots that seemed to shift and move as they walked through the rooms. He began to suspect that the haunting of Borley Rectory was more complex than he had initially thought. It wasn't just the restless spirit of a nun. There was something else at work, something darker, something more malevolent. Foister decided to conduct a seance, hoping to make contact with the spirits of the house. He gathered Marianne and Henry in the drawing room, and they sat around a small table, their hands resting on its surface. Foister began to chant, his voice low and resonant, invoking the spirits to reveal themselves. The room grew cold, the candles flickering wildly. A low, guttural moan echoed through the room, followed by a series of sharp raps on the table. The table began to shake violently, and the candles were extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. Marianne screamed, her voice filled with terror. Suddenly, a voice, cold and whispery, filled the room. It spoke in a language that none of them understood, a series of hissing sounds and guttural clicks. Then, the voice shifted, speaking in clear, chilling English. "Leave this place," it hissed. "This house belongs to us." The seance was abruptly broken, the room returning to its previous stillness. Foister, shaken but determined, knew that he had to act. He decided to perform an exorcism to cleanse the rectory of its dark presence. The exorcism was a harrowing affair. Foister, armed with his faith and his knowledge of ancient rituals, battled against the unseen forces that held the rectory in their grip. He chanted, he prayed. He invoked the power of God to banish the evil that lurked within the walls. The house seemed to resist, the walls groaning, the windows rattling, the very air crackling with malevolent energy. After hours of struggle, Foister finally managed to drive out the most malevolent presence, a dark entity that had attached itself to the rectory like a parasite. The house seemed to sigh in relief, the oppressive atmosphere lifting, replaced by a sense of peace. But the victory was short-lived. A few weeks later, Foister was found dead in his study, the cause of death unknown. Some whispered that he had been cursed, that the dark forces of Borley Rectory had taken their revenge. The house, though cleansed, still held its secrets, its shadows, its whispers. And the legend of Borley Rectory, the most haunted house in England, continued to grow. The death of Reverend Foister cast a long shadow over Borley Rectory. The Dawsons, though relieved by the initial calming of the house after the exorcism, were now gripped by a renewed sense of fear. The whispers had returned, softer now, more subtle, but still present. The sense of being watched lingered, a constant, unsettling presence. They knew that whatever darkness resided in the rectory, it had not been entirely vanquished. Marianne, her nerves completely shattered, pleaded with Henry to leave the rectory. She could no longer bear the constant fear, the feeling that something malevolent was lurking just beyond the veil of reality. Henry, though reluctant to admit defeat, finally agreed. They packed their belongings, leaving behind the house that had promised so much but delivered only terror. The rectory stood empty once more, a silent sentinel against the Essex landscape. Its reputation as the most haunted house in England grew, attracting ghost hunters, paranormal investigators, and thrill-seekers from all over the world. They came to the rectory, hoping to catch a glimpse of a ghost, to hear the whispers, to experience the chilling atmosphere for themselves. Some claimed to have seen the ghostly figure of the nun, wandering the grounds, her face pale and sorrowful. Others reported hearing the disembodied voices, the scratching sounds, the eerie whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. The stories multiplied, each one adding to the legend of Borley Rectory. In 1939, a fire broke out at the rectory, engulfing the building in flames. The fire raged through the night, reducing the once grand structure to a smoldering ruin. The villagers watched in awe and terror as the rectory burned, some whispering that the fire was the work of the spirits, a final act of vengeance. The fire, however, did not extinguish the legend of Borley Rectory. Even in its ruined state, the house continued to attract visitors. They walked through the ashes, imagining the rooms that once stood, the lives that had been lived within those walls. They felt the chill in the air, the sense of unease, the lingering presence of something otherworldly. Some claimed to see ghostly figures moving among the ruins, shadows flickering in the moonlight. Others reported hearing the whispers, now carried on the wind, echoing through the charred remains of the house. The legend of Borley Rectory, it seemed, was destined to live on, even in its destruction. One cold, misty evening, a group of paranormal investigators visited the ruins of Borley Rectory. They set up their equipment, hoping to capture evidence of the paranormal activity that had been reported for so many years. As they walked through the ashes, they felt the familiar chill, the sense of being watched. Suddenly, one of the investigators pointed to a section of the ruined wall. "Look," he whispered, his voice trembling. "There, in the shadows." The others followed his gaze. In the dim light, they could see a faint figure, a woman in a dark dress, standing near the wall. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. It was the nun, the ghostly figure that had haunted Borley Rectory for so many years. The investigators watched in stunned silence as the figure slowly faded away, disappearing into the mist. They checked their equipment, but there was no recording, no evidence of what they had seen. But they knew what they had witnessed. They had seen the ghost of Borley Rectory, a chilling reminder of the dark secrets that lay buried beneath the ashes. The legend of Borley Rectory continues to this day. The ruins still stand, a silent testament to the strange and unsettling events that took place within its walls. And the whispers can still be heard if you listen closely enough, carried on the wind, echoing through the ruins, a chilling reminder that some secrets refuse to stay buried. If you've made it this far, congratulations, you're braver than most. But tell me, which story got under your skin the most? Was it the cursed chair, the missing village, or perhaps the man who never needed sleep? Let me know in the comments below. And if you love diving into the world of true horror, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. I have plenty more terrifying stories coming your way. Until next time, keep your doors locked, your lights on, and remember, some things are best left unexplored. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.